Hello guys, welcome to Phoenix What If. So in this video, we will see, what if Naruto awakened primordial power and fell in love with Soifon? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, don't forget to show us some love by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world to us. Now, let's start the story. Chapter 1. The Echo of Creation. The world was dust and echoes. Naruto Uzumaki tasted it on his tongue. A bitter grit of pulverized stone and iron-rich blood. Black rods, thick as his wrist, pinned him to the cratered earth, each one a nail of cold. Dead chakra driven through his flesh, anchoring him in a crucifix of agony and failure. Above him, the sky over what was once Konoha was a bruised, unforgiving gray, choked with the smoke of his burning home. The air, thin and sharp, carried the distant, muffled sounds of a world ending. But the only sound that mattered was the whisper of cloth on stone a few feet away. Hinata Hyuga lay in a crumpled heap. Her dark hair fanned out like spilled ink against the pale rubble. Her eyes, those gentle lavender pools that had always looked at him with a warmth he never felt he deserved, were vacant. Staring at the uncaring sky. She wasn't moving. She wasn't breathing. The word dead was a shard of ice in his gut, a cold, sharp thing that cut deeper than any of the rods piercing his body. I told you, a voice intoned. Calm and measured, as if discussing the weather. It was the voice of God, or at least the man who had claimed the title. Pain. The diva path, with his storm gray eyes and face of serene apathy, stood over him, a silhouette against the bleak sky. Your attachments breed only suffering. This world of ours, this endless, grinding cycle of hatred, it can only be broken by shared pain. She has now felt it. You have now felt it. This is the first step toward true understanding. A scream tried to form in Naruto's throat, but it was a dry, rasping thing, caught behind the lump of grief and rage. He strained against the rods, muscles screaming, sinews threatening to tear. The chakra rods pulsed, a deadening energy flooding his system, disrupting his own flow. Fighting back the boiling crimson tide of the nine tails that was already beginning to leak from his pores. He remembered her words, spoken just moments before, a confession whispered in the face of oblivion. I love you. 3 simple words that had struck him with the force of a Rasengan, words that had made the world stand still for a heartbeat. And then pain had ended that heartbeat. He had swatted her aside like an insect. A casual, contemptuous flick of his hand that had sent her flying, her small frame crashing into the unforgiving ground with a sound that would haunt Naruto for eternity. You, he choked out. The words scraping his raw throat. I have done nothing you shinobi have not done to each other for generations, Pain said, his voice devoid of malice or triumph. It was the voice of a surgeon discussing a necessary amputation. I am simply making the lesson universal. Your village is gone. Your friends are dead or dying. The woman who loved you is a corpse at your feet. Now, you will understand. Now, you will give me the 9 tails, and your sacrifice will serve a greater purpose. Something inside Naruto broke. It wasn't a snap, but a slow, grinding fracture. Like a glacier calving into a frozen sea. The grief was a tidal wave, the rage a volcanic eruption. But beneath it all, a third, colder emotion began to stir. A profound, absolute sense of rejection. He rejected this reality. He rejected this pain. He rejected this God and his twisted sermon. The Kyuubi's power roared to life, a furious, burning thing. Red chakra, thick as blood, erupted from his body, steaming in the cool air. It was a physical presence, a pressure wave of pure malice that pushed against Pain's own divine aura. The ground around him cracked, the rubble vibrating with the sheer force of his hatred. 4 tails of incandescent energy lashed out, then a 5th, then a 6th. His skin peeled away, replaced by the bubbling, healing shroud of the demon fox. His mind began to slip. The familiar red haze of instinct and fury descending, promising the sweet relief of oblivion, of pure, unthinking destruction. Pain watched, his expression unchanged. The beast's rage is predictable. A tantrum against the inevitable. He raised a hand toward the sky. Then let us give it a cage worthy of its power. Chibaku Tensai. A small, black sphere, no larger than a marble, shot from his palm, ascending into the gray clouds. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the world began to tear itself apart. A monstrous gravitational pull emanated from the sphere, ripping chunks of earth, buildings, and splintered trees from the ground. Everything flew upward, crashing together around the black core. The ground beneath Naruto groaned and then shattered, pulling him and the very earth he was pinned to into the sky. He was inside the storm, a speck of rage being swallowed by a rising mountain. The rocks and debris converged, slamming into him, burying him under a crushing weight of stone and dirt. Darkness consumed him as the sphere grew, sealing him within a man-made moon of rock and despair. Inside the suffocating blackness, the Kyuubi's power raged unchecked. "Let me out, boy!" The great fox roared in his mind, its voice a symphony of ancient hatred. "Give yourself to me. I will tear this world to shreds for what it has done. I will burn the very sky." Naruto was on the verge of accepting. The seventh tail was forming. The skeletal structure of the fox was beginning to encase his human form. The seal on his stomach, the intricate calligraphy of the 8 trigrams, was straining. The ink seeming to bleed into his very soul. And as it strained, it touched something else. It wasn't the Kyuubi's chakra. It wasn't Minato's lingering will, or Kushina's love. It was an echo. Phantom sensation left over from the day he was born. The touch of the Shinigami. The cold, absolute finality of the Reaper Death Seal. A power not of the living world, a law that stood outside the flow of chakra. It was an energy of pure order, of ending. In the crucible of Naruto's soul, two absolutes collided. The Kyuubi's chaotic, burning hatred, the essence of life at its most primal and destructive, smashed against the lingering echo of the Shinigami's absolute, silent order, the essence of an unyielding, conceptual end. Fire met ice. Chaos met order. Life met death. And in the silent, impossible space between them, something new was born. The screaming in his mind stopped. The roaring fire of the Kyuubi's chakra was silenced. Not suppressed, not contained. It was simply muted, as if a switch had been flipped on the universe. The red energy didn't vanish. It was consumed, drawn inward into a point of perfect stillness at the center of his being. There was no explosion, no roar of power. There was only silence. A deep, profound silence that swallowed all sound, all thought, all feeling. The crushing pressure of the thousands of tons of rock around him ceased to be a sensation. It was just a fact. A fact he could now change. Outside the massive satellite of rock hanging in the sky, Pain floated, observing his handiwork. It was done. The Jinchuriki was sealed. Soon, the beast's chakra would be exhausted. And he could retrieve it. He turned his attention to the ground, to Konan, who was waiting for his return. Then he felt it. A subtle shift in the air. A wrongness. The Chibaku Tensei, his ultimate sealing jutsu, was humming. A low, vibrational thrum that resonated not in the air, but in the very fabric of space. He looked up. Cracks were appearing on the surface of his creation. But they weren't cracks from an internal explosion. The rock along the edges of the fissures was not breaking, it was dissolving. Turning into fine gray dust, then into shimmering particles of light, and then into nothing at all. The jutsu wasn't being broken. It was being unmade. The process accelerated. Great swaths of the satellite vanished, not exploding outward, but simply ceasing to exist. In seconds, the artificial moon disintegrated into a swirling nebula of motes that faded from reality, leaving only empty space behind. And floating in the center of where it had been, was Naruto. He was no longer wreathed in red chakra. He wasn't a miniature fox or a monster. He was just himself. His torn orange jacket flapped gently in a non-existent breeze. But everything else was different. A faint, almost imperceptible aura surrounded him, a shimmering distortion of the air that bent the light around his form. It was colorless, yet seemed to hold every color at once. His eyes. They were no longer the vibrant blue of the sky. They were twin pools of the deepest midnight, vast and empty, with tiny, distant sparks of silver light swirling within them, like staring into the heart of a nebula. They held no rage, no sorrow, only a terrifying, immeasurable calm. He looked at Pain, and for the first time since their battle began, the god felt a flicker of something he had long since forgotten: uncertainty. The being before him was Naruto Uzumaki, yet it was not. The energy signature was gone. Not suppressed, not hidden. It was simply not there. It was like looking at a hole in the world. What are you? Pain asked, his voice losing its divine certainty for the first time. Naruto didn't answer. He simply raised a hand. He didn't weave a sign or gather chakra. He just crooked his finger. The diva path was suddenly wrenched through the air, pulled toward Naruto by an invisible, irresistible force. It wasn't Shinra Tensei. It wasn't gravity. It felt as if the space between them had simply been deleted. Pain reacted instantly. Shinra Tensei. A massive wave of repulsive force erupted from his body, a power that had leveled a village. It slammed into the space around Naruto and dissipated. It didn't break against a shield. It unraveled, the force scattering into harmless motes of light as it met the silent aura around Naruto's body. Before Pain could process the failure of his ultimate defense, he was there, floating inches from Naruto's face. He looked into those star-filled eyes and saw nothing of the boy he had been fighting. He saw an abyss. Naruto's other hand came up, his palm open. He wasn't gathering wind or nature energy. Instead, the space above his palm began to swirl. Not with blue chakra, but with darkness. A perfect sphere of black, deeper than any shadow, coalesced in his hand. It didn't churn or roar. It was utterly silent. But within that sphere, microscopic points of silver and blue light ignited, swirling in elegant, silent spirals. It was a miniature galaxy. A pocket of creation and destruction held casually in his palm. He wasn't wielding a jutsu. He was wielding a fundamental law of the universe. This is my answer, Naruto's voice said. It was his voice. Yet it resonated differently, carrying the weight of eons. It was quiet, yet it filled the world. He pushed the silent sphere forward. There was no grinding sound, no concussive force. The moment the sphere touched the Diva Path's chest, the body began to come apart. Not violently. The clothes, the skin, the muscle, the bone, they simply deconstructed. They broke down into their base components. Then into particles, then into a shimmer of fading light that was drawn into the swirling vortex in Naruto's hand. The process was sterile, efficient, and horrifyingly absolute. In less than a second, the Diva Path, the most powerful of the 6 paths of pain, was gone. Erased. The 5 remaining paths, scattered across the battlefield, crumpled to the ground simultaneously. Their shared vision and connection severed. The link was broken. Naruto let the sphere in his hand dissipate, the tiny galaxy folding in on itself and vanishing into nothingness. He turned his gaze southward. His cosmic eyes seeing not with sight, but with a new, terrifying clarity. He could feel the threads of chakra that had connected the paths, leading back to their source. A fragile, emaciated man hidden inside a tree made of paper. He didn't need a sensory ninja to guide him. He could feel the tear in the fabric of reality that was Nagato Uzumaki. He drifted downward, his feet too, ooching the shattered ground without a sound. He walked past the fallen forms of his friends, past the rubble of his home. He walked over to where Hinata lay. Kneeling beside her, he gently reached out, his hand hovering over her still chest. A soft, silvery light, like the starlight in his eyes, flowed from his fingertips. It wasn't medical ninjutsu. It was something else. He wasn't healing her wounds. He was reminding her body of the state it was in before it was broken. He was rewriting the last few minutes of her existence. Her chest hitched. A ragged breath shuddered through her lips. Color began to return to her pale skin. Her eyes fluttered open, confused, looking up at him. She saw his eyes and gasped, a flicker of fear in her gaze. She saw a universe where a boy's blue eyes used to be. Naruto simply gave her a faint, sad smile. The expression looked alien on his transformed face. He stood and continued his walk, his pace unhurried, his destination absolute. The silent, colorful SS aura around him made the very air feel thin and sacred. The shinobi of Konoha, those who were still conscious, could only watch in stunned, terrified silence. They had prayed for a savior, a hero to defeat God. They had gotten something else entirely. Something older, and infinitely more powerful. Thousands of leagues away, in a dimension separate from the elemental nations, the very fabric of existence hiccuped. It was not a tremor that could be felt by normal beings. It was a subtle, quantum-level shudder, a momentary glitch in the cosmic code. In the Seraite, the fortified citadel of the Soul Society, most of its inhabitants felt nothing. A captain might have paused, a vague sense of unease passing over them before they dismissed it. But in the sterile, Chaotic laboratories of the 12th Division, something screamed. It was not a person. It was a machine. A bizarre contraption of Mayuri Kuretsuchi's own design, a web of soul-infused glass, pulsating spirit veins, and arcane sensors calibrated to detect the impossible. For over a century, it had remained silent, a monument to its creator's paranoia. Its purpose was to detect energy signatures that defied the known laws of Reishi, Ryutsu, Kishi, and Chakra, to find things that should not exist. Now, a single, pure, crystalline chime echoed through the lab. It was a note of perfect resonance that shattered every piece of glassware on the shelves. It was a sound that, according to the laws of spiritual acoustics, was impossible to produce. Captain Mayuri Kuretsuchi, his face painted in its usual ghoulish black and white, looked up from a particularly gruesome dissection with an expression of pure, unadulterated ecstasy. His golden eyes gleamed with predatory light. "Nemu," he said, his voice a gleeful rasp. "Report." His lieutenant, Nemu Kuretsuchi, moved with her typical placid grace to a bank of monitors, her face impassive. "Captain, all readings are contradictory." "Contradictory is the sweet nectar of discovery, my dear," Mayuri purred, wiping viscous fluid from his scalpel onto his sleeve. "Elaborate. The energy signature's origin point is in a dimension designated Elemental Prime 7 feet, Nemu stated, her voice a monotone. "However, its properties are nonsensical. The device is registering simultaneous positive and negative Rarioku outputs. It possesses the spiritual density of a Vasto Lord-class entity, yet has zero discernible Ryutsu. It is creating and nullifying matter in the same quantum moment. It is a paradox." Mayuri was practically vibrating with excitement. He strode over to the console, pushing Nemu aside to stare at the scrolling data. It was beautiful. It was elegant. It was an insult to every known scientific principle he had ever mastered. A zero-point energy event. An echo of creation itself. Originating from a backwater world of chakra-wielding mortals. "It's not just a paradox," he whispered, his grin stretching unnaturally wide. "It's a new variable. A key that could unlock a whole new box of toys." He jabbed a button on the console. "Send this data to Central 46 and the Captain Commander. Classify it as a cosmological anomaly, threat level, absolute. I want to know what it is. I want to see it. I want to take it apart, piece by lovely piece." The data stream shot through the Serite's spiritual network, an urgent pulse of impossible information. Within minutes, it reached the Spartan, imposing chambers of the 1st Division. Head Captain Genryusai Shigekuni Yamamoto stood, as he often did, in quiet contemplation, his ancient, scarred body radiating an authority that was as palpable as the heat of his Ryujin Jaka. The air in his presence was always still, always heavy. He had already felt the shudder. It wasn't a ripple from Hueco Mundo, no. The faint tremor of a new Quincy stirring. It was something else. A deep, resonant thrum on a frequency he hadn't felt in over 1,000 years. It reminded him of the chaotic, formless energies T had existed before the Soul King had brought order to the worlds. An aide, a seated officer of the 1st Division, entered, his movements stiff with reverence and fear. He knelt, presenting the data slate from the 12th Division. "Captain Commander. An urgent report from Captain Kuretsuchi." Yamamoto did not move. He simply opened one eye, a sliver of ancient power that seemed to see through the man, through the walls, and into the heart of the report itself. He read the data without touching the slate, his spiritual senses absorbing the information. A paradox. A zero-point event. A silent echo. His grip on his cane tightened. The old wood groaning under the pressure. This was not a matter for science or dissection. This was a matter of balance. An energy like this, a power that could seemingly rewrite the rules of existence, was a threat of the highest order. If it was hostile, it could unmake them all. If it was unstable, it could shatter the fragile peace between dimensions. It could not be ignored. It could not be allowed to fester. This was not a job for a squadron of brutes like Kenpachi's division, nor for the meticulous philosophers of the 5th. It required speed, stealth, and a will cold and sharp enough to cut through the unknown. It required an assassin. "Summon the commander-in-chief of the Onmitsukido," Yamamoto's voice rumbled, the command echoing with the weight of centuries. Immediately, the officer scurried away, leaving the old man alone with his thoughts. The world was changing. A new piece was on the board, one that obeyed none of the old rules. A few minutes later, a flicker of movement in the corner of the room resolved into a solid form. Captain Soifon of the 2nd Division, commander of the Secret Mobile Corps, knelt on one knee, her head bowed. She was a vision of compact lethality, her small frame belying a spiritual pressure as sharp and cold as a shard of ice. Her movements had been utterly silent, her presence only detectable when she chose to allow it. "You summoned me, head captain," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. Yamamoto turned slowly to face her, his ancient eyes boring into her. "An anomaly has appeared in the world of the living. In a dimension we have long observed but rarely interfered with. The 12th Division classifies it as a threat of unknown magnitude. Its nature is primordial." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "I do not trust Captain Kuretsuchi's motives. His desire to dissect it may provoke it. I do not trust a full-scale deployment, as it may be perceived as an invasion. This requires a scalpel, not a sledgehammer." Soifon remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable behind her mask of discipline. "My orders. You will proceed to the origin point of the disturbance alone," Yamamoto commanded. "You are to observe this anomaly. Ascertain its nature, its intelligence, its intent. Assess its threat level to the balance of our worlds." He looked down at her, his gaze unwavering. "Your final directive is absolute. If you deem it an uncontrollable threat, you are to eliminate it. Erase it completely, before it has a chance to grow. Do you understand, Captain Soifon?" There was no hesitation. No question. There was only duty. For Soifon, the word of the head captain was law, the stability of the Seraite her only creed. An anomaly was a disruption. A disruption was an enemy of order. And enemies were to be dispatched with swift, merciless precision. She raised her head, her dark eyes meeting his. They were the eyes of a predator, a blade perfectly honed for its purpose. "Understood," she said. "Consider it done." With another flicker of shunpo, she was gone, a silent phantom on her way to investigate the boy who had just remade his world. Completely unaware that he was about to remake hers as well. Chapter 1 End. Chapter 2. The Silent Blade in the Land of Fire. The Land of Fire was an assault on the senses. After the sterile, ordered Ryutsu of the Seraite, the world of the living felt loud. Not in sound, but in essence. Life screamed from every blade of grass, every buzzing insect, every gust of wind rustling the thick, emerald canopy of the trees. It was a chaotic, untamed energy that grated on Soifon's disciplined senses. She moved through it like a ghost, a sliver of silent, focused order in a world of vibrant disarray. Her infiltration had been trivially easy. Crossing the Dongai, she had stepped into the physical world, cloaking her spiritual presence until it was little more than a whisper, a cold spot in the warm air that only the most highly trained sensor would notice, and even then, would likely dismiss as a trick of the mind. The shinobi border patrols were a joke, their senses attuned only to the clumsy signature of chakra. They were deaf and blind to a being who walked between the particles of the world. She had passed through their lines like smoke through a screen door. Konoha, the hidden leaf village, was not the ruin she had expected. The reports had spoken of total annihilation, a crater where a village once stood. Instead, she found a whirlwind of frantic, determined reconstruction. The crater was still there, a massive, sobering scar in the heart of the valley, but the village was already rising from its own ashes. Wood-style jutsu, a technique she recognized from archival intelligence reports, had already erected the skeletons of new buildings, their pale wood gleaming in the afternoon sun. The sound of hammers, saws, and shouted orders filled the air, a testament to the stubborn, resilient spirit of its people. It was admirable and foolish. Such emotional determination was a weakness, a refusal to accept the reality of their loss. For a week, she watched. She became a shadow on the rooftops. A flicker in an alleyway, a forgotten face in a crowd. She suppressed her reishi to the point of non-existence, wearing a simple, nondescript traveler's cloak over her shihakusho, her zanpakuto, suzambaki. Strapped horizontally across the small of her back, perfectly concealed. Her mission was to observe the anomaly, the being designated Naruto Uzumaki, and she was nothing if not thorough. Her first observation was that the boy was the epicenter of this chaotic storm of rebuilding. He was everywhere at once, a blur of orange and blonde hair. He wasn't directing the efforts like a commander. He was in the thick of it, a one-man labor force. He hauled lumber that should have required 10 men, his movements tireless. He used his infamous shadow clones, a technique she found crude but brutally effective, to multiply his efforts, 1,000 identical figures swarming over the construction sites, raising walls and laying foundations with an unnatural speed. The villagers adored him. They called his name, offered him water and food which he always accepted with a grin so wide it seemed to split his face. They clapped him on the back, ruffled his hair. This was the hero who had saved them. The boy who had defeated a god. They looked at him with a mixture of awe, gratitude, and a deep, abiding affection. But Soifon saw something else in their eyes, something they themselves might not have recognized. A sliver of fear, an unconscious flinch when he moved too quickly. A careful distance they maintained, even in their adoration. They were celebrating a tamed monster. But they had not forgotten the cage had been broken. They were grateful for the typhoon that had put out the fire, but they were terrified of the wind. Soifon understood that fear. She had disected the energy readings from the 12th division. The anomaly wasn't just powerful, it was fundamentally wrong. It obeyed no laws. During his battle with the entity called Pain, he had not overwhelmed his opponent's jutsu. He had erased it. He hadn't broken the planetary seal, he had unmade it. He wielded a power of absolute nullification, a conceptual weapon that treated reality as a suggestion. And this cosmic, reality-bending power was housed in the body of an emotional, impulsive, 16-year-old boy. It was the universe's cruelest joke. She watched him at night, when the hammers fell. Silent and the village settled into an exhausted sleep. He didn't sleep in any of the newly constructed barracks. He went to the old training grounds, the ones on the outskirts of the village that had been largely untouched by the destruction. There, he would sit for hours, simply staring at his hands. From her perch in the high branches of an ancient oak, she could feel the wrongness emanating from him even from a distance. The air around him was thin, distorted. Sometimes, a pebble near his foot would simply vanish. A leaf falling from a tree would dissolve into mist before it touched the ground. He was a walking hole in the world, and he didn't even seem to be aware of it. He was a child holding a live grenade, convinced it was a toy. The head captain's orders were clear. If the threat was uncontrollable, it was to be eliminated. From everything she had seen, control was a concept Naruto Uzumaki had yet to master. Elimination seemed less a possibility and more an inevitability. Her observations were not the only ones being conducted. On her third day in the village, she detected another presence, one that moved with a silence and purpose that was almost familiar. It was a shinobi, but one who moved with the discipline of an assassin, not the boisterous confidence of the typical Konoha ninja. He was old, his face a mask of scars, his right eye bandaged, his arm in a sling. He walked with a cane. The very image of a frail elder statesman. But his chakra signature, though heavily suppressed, was cold and hard as iron. She shadowed him, her own presence completely undetectable to his senses. She learned his name. Danzo Shimura. A village elder, a rival of the third Hokage, and the commander of a clandestine black ops group known as Root. A faction that officially did not exist. She watched as he met with his operatives in the shadowed tunnels that ran beneath the village like a diseased root system. Their chakra was sealed, their faces hidden behind blank, white masks. They were soldiers without identity. Tools honed for a single purpose. The protection and preservation of Konoha, through any means necessary. The boy is a liability. Danzo's voice, a dry, rasping whisper, echoed in the subterranean chamber. His power is absolute, but his will is weak, governed by sentiment. He is a divine weapon left in the hands of a child. What are your orders, Lord Danzo? One of the Root Anbu asked. His voice devoid of inflection. We continue to observe, Danzo said. The council is weak, swayed by Tsunade's bleeding heart affection for the boy. They see a hero. I see a Jinchuriki who has broken his leash. We need to understand the nature of this new power. If it can be controlled, it will be the ultimate deterrent, the final word in the wars to come. If not, he let the sentence hang in the cold, damp air. Then it must be contained. Or dismantled. For the good of the village. Soifon listened, her expression unchanging. She recognized Danzo's philosophy. It was the cold, hard logic of the Onmitsukido, twisted into something uglier, something born of paranoia and a lust for power. He saw Naruto as a weapon to be wielded. She saw him as a threat to be neutralized. In the end, their conclusions might be the same, but their methods would be vastly different. Danzo would seek to cage the tiger. Soifon would simply kill it. The moment she had been waiting for. The opportunity for a direct assessment came on the seventh night. The moon was a perfect, silver disk in a sea of stars, bathing the land in a soft, ethereal light. The great stone faces of the Hokage, carved into the mountain overlooking the village, seemed to watch over their recovering home with silent stoicism. Naruto was there, sitting on the carved head of the fourth Hokage, his legs dangling over the precipice. The wind, clean and cool at this height, whipped through his blonde hair. He wasn't training. He wasn't meditating. He was just sitting, a solitary figure outlined against the night sky. The ambient energy around him was more pronounced here, away from the bustling life of the village. The very stone beneath him seemed to hum with a discordant energy. Soifon decided it was time. She moved, not with Shunpo's overt burst of speed, but with a slower, more deliberate application of the same art. She flowed through the shadows, her feet making no sound on the stone, her presence suppressed to nothing. She was the night itself, a convergence of shadow and silence. He didn't notice her until she was already there. She completed her final step, her movement so fast it was less emotion and more a transition between 2 points in space. One moment, she was 20 feet away. The next, she was behind him, the edge of her unsealed Zanpakuto, the stinger-like blade of Suzumaki, pressed against the soft skin of his throat. The cold steel should have drawn blood. It didn't. The blade stopped a millimeter from his skin, held back by an invisible, unyielding force. It felt like trying to cut through solid space. Soifon's eyes, cold and analytical, narrowed. The anomaly's defensive aura was passive, instinctual. He hadn't even reacted, yet his power had. Naruto froze. He hadn't sensed a thing. No chakra, no killing intent, no sound. Just a sudden, chilling cold at his neck. He slowly raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. Okay, you got me, he said, his voice surprisingly calm. Whoever you are, you're good. Really good. Better than old man Kakashi, even. So, what do you want? If it's my wallet, I think I left it in my other jacket. Soifon did not move. She applied more pressure. The invisible barrier held firm, the blade vibrating with the frustrated force behind it. Your name is Naruto Uzumaki. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact. Her voice was like chipping ice, cold and sharp. That's me, he replied. He still hadn't turned around. And you are. That is not your concern, she said. My concern is the power you now wield. The energy you released during your battle 7 days ago. It sent a ripple across worlds. It has drawn unwanted attention. Explain it. Naruto was silent for a moment. He tilted his head slightly, a strange, thoughtful gesture. A ripple across worlds, huh? So that's what that was. He let out a slow breath. I don't know if I can explain it. It just happened. I was angry. I was hurt. And then, something changed. It's like, before, I had to yell to be heard. Now, all I have to do is whisper. A whisper that can unmake a mountain, Soifon stated, her voice flat. A power that defies every known law of chakra and spiritual energy. You are an anomaly, a disruption to the natural order. Such things cannot be allowed to exist. Finally, he turned his head, his movement slow and deliberate. His blue eyes met her dark, intense gaze. They were just blue eyes tonight, the cosmic fire she had heard about in the reports banked, hidden beneath the surface. He looked at the blade at his throat, then at her face. Her stern, unforgiving expression. So you're here to kill me, then? He asked. There was no fear in his voice. Only a deep, profound weariness. Get in line. See. Ms. Like everyone wants to either kill me or control me these days. If I had wanted you dead, you would be, she said, and it was the simple, unvarnished truth. This is an assessment. Your very existence is a threat. Convince me it is not. Naruto looked away from her, his gaze drifting over the recovering village below. The lights from the newly built homes were warm, yellow pinpricks in the darkness. You see a threat, he said quietly. I see a second chance. I have this power. And I don't understand it. It scares me, to be honest. But it saved my home. It saved my friends. As long as I can use it to protect them, I will. That's all that matters. Sentiment, Soifon scoffed, the word a drop of poison. The most dangerous and unpredictable of all variables. Your desire to protect is a meaningless concept. What if protecting your friends means destroying another's home? What if your power lashes out in a moment of anger and vaporizes the very people you seek to save? Power without absolute control is nothing more than a prelude to disaster. And I suppose you have absolute control, he countered, a spark of his old fire returning to his voice. He turned fully to face her now, forcing her to withdraw her blade a few inches. He stood up, and for the first time, she could take his full measure. He was taller than she was, broad-shouldered from years of relentless training. But the overwhelming impression was one of contained energy. The air around him was heavy. You think that because you can sneak up on people and hold a blade to their throat, you understand power. That's not power. That's just being quiet and pointy. A muscle in Soifon's jaw twitched. The boy's insolence was infuriating. I am a captain of the Gote 13. I am the commander of the Onmitsukido. I have trained for over a century to be a perfect instrument of war and justice. My control is absolute. My will is unbreakable. My resolve is steel. Great speech, Naruto said, unimpressed. But you're just following orders, aren't you? Some old guy in a robe told you I was a disruption to the natural order, and you said, yes, sir, and came running. You haven't even tried to understand. You just want to put things in a box. Threat. Not a threat. Good. Bad. The world's not that simple. Simplicity is clarity, she shot back, her voice dangerously low. Clarity is the foundation of order. And order is what separates us from beasts. No, Naruto said, shaking his head. Choice is what separates us. I'm choosing to use this power to help. You're choosing to threaten a guy you just met because your boss told you to. Who's the real beast here? The insult struck a nerve, far deeper than he could have known. It echoed with the ghost of another's words, a mentor who had abandoned her and the very concept of order she now clung to. Yoruichi. The thought was a flare of heat in her icy composure. She moved. It wasn't an attack, but a test. A demonstration. She used Shunpo, not to its full extent, but enough to create a dozen afterimages of herself, a circle of silent, deadly assassins surrounding him, each one a perfect duplicate. It was a technique designed to disorient and overwhelm. Naruto didn't even turn his head. He didn't try to track her movements with his eyes. He just stood there, and the air around him warped. Soifon's afterimages flickered, distorted, as if she were viewing them through imperfect, rippling water. Her senses, honed by a century of combat, screamed at her. The space she was moving through was becoming unstable, inconsistent. It was like trying to run on ground that was shifting from solid to liquid with every step. Her perfect, controlled technique was being disrupted by his mere presence. She consolidated back into a single form, 10 feet away. Her hand resting on the hilt of her Zanpakuto. A flicker of genuine disbelief crossed her features before being suppressed. Naruto hadn't moved a muscle. He just looked at her, his express on a mixture of sadness and frustration. See, you try to show off, and whatever this is, just doesn't care. It doesn't follow the rules. It makes its own. I can't control it yet. But I'm trying. That's more than you're doing. You're just pointing your sword at the problem. The encounter had reached a stalemate. She could not harm him with a surprise attack. Her superior speed was being negated by his passive reality warping field. A direct confrontation was pointless. She was here to assess, not to engage in a battle that could level the mountain they stood on. And his words, as simplistic and sentimental as they were, held a frustrating grain of truth. He was a paradox. A being of immense, uncontrollable power who was, at his core, trying to do the right thing. It was a Vari. Abel her black and white worldview was ill-equipped to handle. Your existence remains a threat, she said, her voice regaining its cold, professional tone. She needed to reassert control of the situation. Your intentions are irrelevant. The next time we meet, it will not be for a conversation. I will be the instrument of your erasure. Tame the storm inside you, Naruto Uzumaki. Or it will be silenced for you. With a final, sharp look, she vanished in a flicker of shunpo, her presence disappearing completely. This time, she didn't just move away. She retreated to a safe distance, her mind racing. The assessment was more complicated than she had anticipated. The anomaly was intelligent, defiant, and possessed a passive defense that made a simple assassination nearly impossible. He was also, infuriatingly, not the mindless monster she had expected. Naruto stood alone on the Hokage monument, the silence of the night rushing back in to fill the space where she had been. He let out a long, shuddering breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He ran a hand through his hair, his fingers trembling slightly. He had projected a calm he did not feel. The woman, she was something else entirely. She moved like a whisper and had eyes that saw him not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. And that blade at his throat, he had felt the finality in it. If his strange new power hadn't stopped it, she would have ended him without a moment's hesitation. A ripple across worlds. He looked up at the moon, feeling smaller than he had ever felt before. He had beaten a self-proclaimed god, only to learn that there were entire worlds beyond his own, filled with forces that now saw him as a target. The victory that had made him a hero to his village had also painted a target on his back for the rest of the universe. He looked down at his hands, the faint, colorless aura shimmering around them in the moonlight. Tame the storm, she had said. He wasn't even sure he knew how to find the shore. Chapter 2 End. Chapter 3. The root of the problem. The silence Naruto left on the Hokage monument was a different kind of quiet from the one he'd grown up with. The old silence was born of absence, empty apartments, lonely swings. The averted gazes of villagers. This new silence was born of presence. It was the quiet of a held breath, of a universe waiting for the other shoe to drop. He felt it in the core of his being. A low hum of potential that was both a promise and a threat. He spent the next few days in a self-imposed exile at Training Ground 44, the infamous Forest of Death. It was the one place in Konoha where no one would willingly follow him, a tangled, primeval labyrinth of monstrous flora and fauna. It was the perfect place to be alone with the monster inside himself. He wasn't trying to master the new power. He didn't even know where to begin. It wasn't like chakra, a wellspring he could draw from. It was more like an extra sense, a fundamental shift in his perception of reality. He was trying to understand its grammar, the rules by which it operated. The results were frustratingly inconsistent. He'd stare at a boulder, trying to will it out of existence as he had done to Pain's Chibaku Tensai. And nothing would happen. He'd spend an hour trying to replicate the miniature galaxy he had formed in his palm, only to get a splitting headache. Yet, the power manifested in other ways, small and unsettling. A giant, venomous centipede lunged at him from the undergrowth, and without a thought, a perfect shield of warped space shimmered into existence before him, ca. Using the creature's armored head to simply flatten and spread out like clay hitting a wall. He'd trip on a root, and for a split second, he would float an inch above the ground before stumbling. It was reactive, instinctual. It was a cosmic immune system, protecting its host from immediate threats but refusing to perform on command. It was like having a god in his passenger seat, asleep most of the time, but occasionally waking up to grab the wheel and avert a crash before dozing off again. The frustration was immense. It was the ultimate power, and he was too stupid to figure out the on switch. During these frustrating sessions, he felt watched. It was a constant, prickling sensation on the back of his neck. At first, he thought it was the woman with the killer's eyes, Soifon. He'd learned her name was. After a discreet and very nervous inquiry with one of Tsunade's intelligence officers. But this was different. Her presence had been cold and sharp, a single point of focused intent. This was diffuse, slithering. Like spiders crawling just beyond his line of sight. He'd spin around, trying to catch a glimpse, but there was never anything there. It was a ghost in the trees, a whisper in the leaves. And it was slowly driving him mad. He was not, in fact, going mad. His paranoia was perfectly justified. Hidden deep within the earth beneath the recovering village, in a sterile, gray chamber lit by cold chakra lamps. Danzo Shimura watched Naruto's every move on a large, watery orb. The orb was linked to a dozen root operatives scattered invisibly throughout the forest of death. Their senses feeding directly back to their master. He cannot control it, Yamanaka observed, his featureless mask turned toward Danzo. His efforts are crude, like a child trying to wield a blacksmith's hammer. He has no discipline, no methodology, which makes him all the more dangerous. Danzo's voice was a dry rustle of dead leaves. He tapped a gnarled finger on the arm of his chair. He had seen the reports from the Pain Invasion, had cross-referenced them with the eyewitness accounts. The power Naruto had displayed was not an extension of the Kyuubi. It was something new, something foundational. The potential was staggering. In the right hands, such power could end the endless cycle of war, uniting the nations under Konoha's unshakable authority. In Naruto's hands, it was a time bomb. Lord Danzo. Torun Aburame prompted, his high-collared jacket obscuring his face. From his sleeves, a faint, ominous buzzing could be heard. Your orders. Danzo's visible eye narrowed. The time for observation was over. Tsunade was too sentimental to do what was necessary. The remaining council elders were cowards. It fell to him, as it always did, to be the darkness that protected the light. The liability has been assessed. The asset must now be acquired. Prepare the CSS squad. Capture. Suppress. Seal. Fu and Torun bowed their heads in perfect unison. There was no discussion. No question of morality. An order was given. It would be obeyed. That was the way of Root. The trap was laid with insidious precision. They knew Naruto. They had studied his psychological profile for years. They knew his weaknesses were not physical. They were his heart. Late that afternoon, as Naruto was packing up his meager training gear, a sound drifted through the dense woods. It was faint, but unmistakable. The sound of a child crying. A small, desperate sob for help. Naruto froze. Every shinobi instinct screamed at him that it was a trap. The forest of death was a restricted zone. No child should be in here. It was too convenient, too perfect. But the sound, it was so real, so full of fear. What if it wasn't a trap? What if some kid really had wandered in and was about to be eaten by a giant tiger? He couldn't live with himself if he just walked away. His sentiment, as Danzo had predicted, overrode his caution. Hello, he called out, jogging toward the sound. Is someone there? Don't worry, I'm coming. He followed the cries deeper into a part of the forest where the canopy was so thick it cast the ground in a perpetual twilight. The trees here were ancient and twisted, their branches like skeletal arms. The sobbing led him into a small, unnaturally clear glade. And then, it stopped. The forest fell completely, deathly silent. Naruto skidded to a halt, his senses finally screaming at full volume. The air was thick, heavy with unseen pressure. He had walked right into it. Okay. Very funny, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. You can come out now. The attack did not come from the trees. It came from within his own mind. A sudden, crippling wave of despair washed over him, so potent it buckled his knees. It wasn't his own feeling. It was an invasive, Omu's thing injected directly into his psyche. The face of Jiraiya, bloody and smiling sadly as he sank into the depths, flashed before his eyes. You let me die, Naruto. The image of Hinata, crumpled and broken at his feet. You were too weak. The faces of the villagers who had scorned him, their eyes filled with hatred and fear. Demon. Monster. It was a psychic assault, a storm of his deepest fears and failures. He clutched his head, a raw scream tearing from his throat as he fell to his knees. His focus shattered. His connection to the world around him dissolved into a swirl of guilt and pain. This was Yamanaka's mind-cursed seal jutsu, a technique that didn't just create illusions, but weaponized the target's own memories against them. In the split second that Naruto was crippled by the mental onslaught, the physical trap sprung. The ground beneath him turned to mud, thick and grasping, sucking him down to his shins. From the shadows of the trees, a dozen figures in white masks and black cloaks emerged. One slammed his hands on the ground. Earth-style. Rock prison. 4 thick walls of stone erupted around Naruto, slamming together to form a tight, claustrophobic box, plunging him into darkness. Before he could even react, he felt 1,000 tiny pinpricks on his skin. A swarm of insects, black and unnaturally silent, had covered his body, their microscopic stingers injecting a cold. deadening poison into his system. These were Torun's nano-insects, each one carrying a parasitic cursed seal. The effect was immediate and horrifying. He felt his connection to his own power, to both his chakra and the new primordial hum, begin to gutter and fade. It was like a tap being forced shut. The insects were not just poisoning him, they were eating his energy, suppressing it, sealing it away from him. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the haze of the mental attack. He roared, a wave of raw, unfocused power erupting from him. The silent, colorless aura flared. The rock prison didn't explode. It simply dissolved into sand. The mud around his legs turned to dry dust. The first layer of insects on his skin vaporized into nothingness. But the assault was relentless. More insects swarmed him. Wood bindings, thick as pythons, shot from the ground, wrapping around his limbs, his torso, his neck. The mental attack intensified, showing him a vision of his friends, Sakura, Kakashi, Shikamaru, turning their backs on him, their faces cold with fear and disgust. You're not one of us anymore. He was being overwhelmed, dissected. His power was a fortress, but they weren't laying siege to it. They had poisoned the well from the inside. Miles away, perched silently atop the highest branch of a tree that brushed the clouds, Soifon watched the scene unfold with cold, analytical detachment. Her senses were far beyond those of the shinobi. She didn't just see the attack, she perceived the flow of energies, the psychic assault, the parasitic nature of the cursed seals. It was a well-executed ambush. Brutal, efficient, and tailored perfectly to the target's weaknesses. Her mission was to observe. Her secondary objective was to eliminate the anomaly if it proved uncontrollable. These shinobi, this root faction, were interfering. Her mind, a finely tuned strategic engine, processed the variables at lightning speed. Scenario A. Root succeeds. They capture the anomaly. This power, which bends reality, falls into the hands of a man like Danzo. A man whose ambition was a palpable stench even from this distance. He would try to weaponize it. The potential for catastrophe was immense. An unstable, primordial power wielded by a ruthless, clandestine organization could destabilize this entire world, creating a threat far greater than a single, emotionally driven boy. Unacceptable risk. Scenario B. Root fails. They push Naruto too far. Cornered, terrified, and in agony, his power erupts uncontrollably. Not the focused erasure he used on pain, but a raw, untamed cataclysm. An explosion of reality nullification that could wipe this forest, the village, perhaps the entire country, off the map. A possibility she would then be forced to contain, likely resulting in a conflict of unimaginable scale. Unacceptable risk. Both outcomes were suboptimal. She was presented with a tactical dilemma. Adhering to her non-interference orders would allow one of two unacceptable scenarios to play out. Intervening was a direct violation of the head captain's command. She looked down at the masked shinobi. She saw their blank, emotionless masks, their sterile efficiency. They were tools. Their humanity stripped away in service of a cause. They moved with the cold logic of assassins, but without the code of justice that, however tenuously, governed the Gote 13. They were a perversion of order. A cancer pretending to be the cure. Her decision was made in a heartbeat. It wasn't born of compassion for the boy. It was a cold, calculated choice. The immediate, predictable threat of Root was a variable that could be controlled. The long-term, unpredictable threat of Danzo wielding primordial power, or Naruto unleashing a cataclysm, were variables that could not. She would eliminate the immediate threat to stabilize the situation and preserve her primary mission. It was the most logical course of action. Her descent from the treetop was not a fall, it was an erasure of altitude. She didn't stir a single leaf. One moment she was a silhouette against the sky, the next she was a phantom on the forest floor. Fu Yamanaka stood at the edge of the glade, his hands in a meditative seal, focusing the full force of his psychic attack on the struggling boy. He was the linchpin. Soifon identified him in an instant. She moved, a blur of motion so fast it barely registered as a flicker in the dim light. She didn't even draw her blade. The pommel of her sheathed Zanpakuto swung with the focused, kinetic force of a master of Hakuda, connected with the precise point at the base of Fu's skull. There was a soft thump, and the root operative crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut, the mental assault on Naruto vanishing in an instant. The psychic fog in Naruto's mind evaporated. The crushing guilt, the paralyzing fear, gone. All that remained was a burning, furious clarity. He saw the masked figures, the wood bindings, the insects crawling over him. And he saw her. A small, compact figure in black. A silent whirlwind of death that had just appeared in the middle of his enemies. You. He gasped, a mixture of shock and disbelief. Soifon ignored him. Her eyes scanned the battlefield. Her mind already mapping the positions and threat levels of the remaining dozen operatives. Distraction, she said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the chaos. It was not a suggestion. It was a command. Naruto didn't need to be told twice. A guttural roar ripped from his chest. Get off me. His primordial aura exploded outward, not as a subtle warp, but as a concussive wave of pure force. It wasn't an attack that destroyed, it was one that rejected. The thick wood bindings didn't splinter. They aged 1,000 years in a second, turning to gray, brittle dust. The swarming insects were flash frozen, not by ice, but by a sudden, localized drop to absolute zero, and fell to the ground in a crystalline shower. The root agents were thrown back, not by a physical blast, but as if the very space they occupied had violently expanded. It was the opening Soifon needed. She moved among the disoriented root Anbu like a hornet in a field of cattle. Her shunpo was a masterpiece of efficiency. Each step a precise calculation. She appeared behind one agent, her blade still sheathed, and delivered a single, sharp jab to a nerve cluster in his arm, rendering it useless. She flowed past another, the back of her heel striking his knee with a sickening crunch. She drew Suzumaki. The blade, a small, stinger-like weapon attached to a gauntlet on her middle finger, seemed too small to be a threat. A root agent, recovering his balance, lunged at her with a tanto. She sidestepped the clumsy thrust, and her blade flickered out, tapping him once on the chest. A small, black butterfly shape, a homunca, appeared on his uniform. Before he could even register the strike, she had moved on. Naruto, now free, joined the fray. If Soifon was a scalpel, he was a sledgehammer. He didn't bother with elegant taijutsu. He simply charged, his fists glowing with the faint, colorless aura. He punched the ground, and the earth in front of him didn't crack, it turned to a fine, glassy powder. He threw a punch at an agent who raised an earth wall to defend himself, and his fist passed through the wall as if it were smoke, the rock deconstructing on contact, before slamming into the man's chest. They were a study in contrasts, a chaotic ballet of destruction and precision. Naruto's overwhelming, reality-breaking power created openings, shattered defenses, and drew the enemy's attention. Soifon, a phantom in the chaos he created, moved through those openings, dismantling the enemy squad with a terrifying, almost surgical, efficiency. She appeared beside the man she had marked earlier, who was now engaged with a shadow clone. Her stinger flickered again, tapping the same spot on his chest. Naigeki Kesatsu. Two-step kill. The man froze, his eyes wide, before he collapsed. A faint discoloration spreading from the point of impact. Dead before he hit the ground. Torunoburame, seeing the battle lost, made a last, desperate move. He tore open his jacket, revealing a horrifying mass of insects writhing beneath his skin. Forbidden jutsu. Jar of malevolence. He hissed. He unleashed his ultimate swarm, a roiling, black cloud of his most potent cursed insects. A vortex of energy devouring death that shot towards Naruto. Naruto braced himself, ready to try and blast it away. But Soifon was there. Don't touch it, she commanded. Create a vacuum. He didn't know what that meant. But he understood the intent. He focused, not on destroying the cloud, but on the space it occupied. He pictured the air, the particles, the very essence of that space, being gone. He pushed his will into that concept. The effect was instantaneous and bizarre. The roaring, buzzing cloud of insects suddenly fell silent. The swarm convulsed, then collapsed in on itself, individual insects dropping from the air like black rain. Deprived of oxygen, they had died in an instant. The remaining root agents, their leaders defeated, their techniques useless, their resolve broken by the sheer impossibility of their opponents, did what they were trained to do when a mission was a catastrophic failure. They melted back into the shadows, vanishing without a trace, leaving their dead and unconscious behind. The glade fell silent again, the only sounds the heavy panting of Naruto and the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. The air was thick with the smell of ozone and death. Naruto stared at Soifon, who was calmly sliding Suzumaki back into its sheath on her gauntlet. She didn't have a scratch on her. There was a long, tense moment. He had a million questions. Why did you help me? What was that? Who the hell are you? But looking at her cold, unreadable face, he knew he wouldn't get a straight answer. She broke the silence, her voice as dry as dust. You have terrible taste in enemies. She nudged one of the unconscious root members with her foot. Who were they? Naruto's anger had faded, replaced by a familiar, bitter ache. These were shinobi of his own village. His own people, sent to capture him like a rabid dog. The part of my village that likes to pretend it doesn't exist, he said, his voice grim. They're called Root. Anbu Black Ops that officially disbanded years ago. They answer to an old warhawk named Danzo. Soifon nodded slowly, filing the information away. Danzo. A name to remember. She looked at Naruto, a flicker of something new in her analytical gaze. It wasn't respect, not yet. But it was a re-evaluation. She had seen his raw, untamed power. But she had also seen him follow her command without hesitation in the heat of battle. She had seen him create a perfect vacuum on a conceptual suggestion. The boy could learn. The anomaly could be controlled. Perhaps. They will be back, she stated simply. Their master will not accept this failure. You are no longer safe in your own home. He knew she was right. Danzo wouldn't stop. And now, he had enemies from another world, too. He was trapped between a village that feared him and a universe that wanted him erased. He looked at this strange, deadly woman who had threatened to kill him and then saved his life in the span of a few days. She wasn't his friend. He wasn't sure what she was. But right now, she was the only one who seemed to have any understanding of the forces at play. They weren't allies. But for the first time, they weren't entirely enemies either. Ey were two predators in a darkening forest, suddenly aware that a far greater threat was circling in the shadows, and that for now, survival might just mean hunting together. Unseen, in a dimension of pure thought, a crystalline entity registered the event. Its observation was cold and without emotion. The anomaly is refining its control. It can now manipulate vacuum. A primitive but notable application of void shaping. The contagion is learning from the other. The bond strengthens. Escalation protocols are now being considered. Chapter 3 End. Chapter 4. The Hollow Deceiver. The aftermath of the ambush was a heavy, ringing silence. The dead root agents lay like discarded dolls in the twilight of the forest of death, their blank white masks a stark, accusing presence. Naruto stood amidst the carnage. The adrenaline of the fight draining away to leave a cold, hollow feeling in its place. He had fought and killed shinobi from his own village. The reality of it was a bitter pill, one he couldn't seem to swallow. Soifon showed no such conflict. She moved with a purpose that was almost unnerving, methodically checking each body, confirming they were dead or incapacitated. It wasn't macabre. It was professional. Like a carpenter checking the integrity of her work. She stopped by the unconscious form of Fuyamanaka, the psychic attacker. This one is still alive, she stated, her voice flat. She looked at Naruto. Her dark eyes unreadable. He is a liability. He knows you fought alongside me. If he reports that to his master, it will complicate matters for both of us. The implication was clear. A quick, silent death would be the logical, efficient solution. Naruto's head snapped up, a protective fire flaring in his eyes. No. No more killing. Not my own people. They are not your people, Soifon countered. Her tone sharp as broken glass. They are instruments of a man who just tried to dissect you. They are enemy combatants who failed in their mission. Sentiment has no place on the battlefield. A loose end is a threat. And I'm telling you, no, he said, his voice low and firm. He walked over and stood between her and Fu's body. We're not murderers. I am an assassin, she corrected him. Her hand resting lightly on the hilt of Suzumaki. It is what I do. Do not mistake my assistance for an alignment of philosophies. I intervened because their success was a greater strategic risk than their failure. Nothing more. They stared at each other for a long moment, the the fundamental chasm between their worlds laid bare. He was all heart, a raw, bleeding engine of emotion and loyalty. She was all logic, a cold, precise equation of risk and reward. Yet, they had just fought together with a synergy that felt deeper than mere battlefield convenience. Before the argument could escalate, a new sensation prickled at the edges of Naruto's awareness. It was a subtle wrongness in the air, a faint, discordant note in the symphony of the world. His primordial power, that slumbering god in his soul, stirred slightly. It wasn't a threat, not yet. It was more like the smell of ozone before a lightning strike. Do you feel that? He asked, his gaze shifting, scanning the darkening woods. Soifon's senses, tuned to the flow of spiritual energy, detected it a moment later. It was a faint, almost non-existent tremor in the fabric of Reishi. It wasn't Ryutsu, the spiritual pressure of a soul. It was a void. A small, localized absence of energy that was somehow expanding. It was coming from the west, from a series of barren, uninhabited valleys near the border of the Land of Fire. It is not chakra, she said, her professional focus snapping back into place. It feels empty, hollow. The word sent a chill down Naruto's spine. It felt right. An unnatural emptiness. A presence defined by absence. He looked at the unconscious root agents, then back in the direction of the strange feeling. Danzo was a problem for tomorrow. This felt like a problem for right now. Let's go, he said. His decision made. We'll drop these guys off at the T&I department. Anko will have a field day with them. Then we check that out. Soifon gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. It was the most logical course of action. A new, unknown variable had appeared on the board, and it took precedence. Their personal conflict was tabled, for now. In the sterile, white expanse of Las Noches, a throne sat empty. Below it, Sosuke Aizen watched an orb of swirling energy, a sophisticated sensor array that dwarfed Mayuri Kuretsuchi's crude device. It showed him the same data, the impossible, paradoxical energy signature from the world of shinobi. But Aizen's interpretation was leagues beyond Mayuri's scientific curiosity or Yamamoto's cautious fear. He saw a key. Chakra was the energy of the physical body and spirit combined. Raryoku was the energy of the soul. They were two sides of the same coin, two different expressions of the energy of life. But what Naruto had unleashed was something else. It was the coin itself. The raw material from which both were minted. A power that predated the Soul King's great act of separation, the primordial soup of creation. The Hogyoku, the device embedded in his chest, craved it. It hummed with a hunger that Aizen himself felt, a desire to understand, to absorb, to evolve. It appears the boy is more interesting than I thought, he mused, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips. Jin Ichimaru, leaning against a nearby pillar, gave a lazy, fox-like grin. Yashuri's not just a fluke. A firecracker that went off a little louder than usual. No, Jin, Aizen said, his gaze fixed on the orb. This is no firecracker. This is a new sun. And I would very much like to know how it burns. His eyes flickered to the side. Ulquiorra. The fourth Espada stepped out of the shadows, his pale form and melancholic green eyes a stark contrast to the brilliant white of the throne room. He bowed his head slightly. Lord Aizen. You felt it as well, I presume. Aizen said. A tremor of nihilism, Ulquiorra stated, his voice a monotone. A wave of non-existence that briefly echoed through all realms. It was significant. Indeed, Aizen's smile widened. I want the source. The boy, Naruto Uzumaki. But I do not want him broken. I do not want him dead. I want him brought to me, intact. This is a task that requires finesse, not brute force. A scalpel, not a sword. He turned his gaze to another figure, one who had been standing silently in the corner, almost forgotten. This Arankar was not like the others. He was not defined by a number or a singular aspect of death. He was slender, almost delicate, wearing the standard white hakama but with a high collar that obscured the lower half of his face. The remnant of his hollow mask was a smooth, porcelain-like plate over his left eye, with intricate, shifting geometric patterns etched onto its surface. His visible right eye was a startling, intelligent amethyst. Locus, Aizen said, your particular talents are required. The Arankar, Locus, bowed deeply. You wish for me to retrieve the specimen, Lord Aizen. His voice was smooth, cultured, with an unnerving lack of inflection. I wish for you to test it, Aizen corrected him gently. Observe the limits of this new power. Understand its nature. If you can capture him without damaging the vessel, do so. If he proves too volatile, then simply gather your data and return. Do not engage the Gote 13 if they interfere. This is a reconnaissance mission, not a declaration of war. Am I understood? Perfectly, my lord, Locus said. He raised a hand, and the space before him seemed to fold in on itself, opening a garganta, a tear in the fabric of reality. But his was different. It wasn't the usual chaotic black maw. It was a clean, perfect circle of darkness that opened with the silent, precise motion of a camera's aperture. He stepped through, and the portal snapped shut without a sound. Aizen watched him go, his smile unwavering. The game was becoming more interesting with every move. The valley was wrong. That was the only word for it. It was a desolate, rocky place, a network of canyons and S's that had been carved by ancient winds. But as Naruto and Soifon approached, the wrongness intensified. The edges of the rocks seemed to fuzz and blur, as if viewed through heat haze, though the air was cool. Distances seemed to shift and change. A canyon that looked a mile away would suddenly be 100 feet from them. The path they had just walked would vanish behind them, replaced by a sheer cliff face. This is not an illusion, Soifon murmured, her hand never leaving her Zanpakuto. Her senses were screaming. The spiritual energy here was being twisted, warped into impossible geometries. This is spatial distortion. Advanced. Highly controlled. So, some kind of space-time jutsu? Naruto asked, trying to plant his feet on ground that felt like it was subtly tilting beneath him. No, she said, her eyes narrowed. This feels like the work of a hollow. A powerful one. As if summoned by her words, a figure appeared on a mesa a short distance away. It was the Arankar, Locus. He stood with a serene, almost academic posture, his hands clasped behind his back. Remarkable, Locus's smooth voice echoed through the valley, seemingly coming from all directions at once. You have detected the nature of my ability. Shinigami. And you are the anomaly. His single amethyst eye fixed on Naruto, a gaze filled with intense, dispassionate curiosity. The energy you radiate is a fascinating contradiction. It is both full and empty, a source of creation and a well of nothingness. Lord Aizen will be most pleased to study you. Aizen. Soifon spat the name like a curse. The pieces clicked into place. The traitor captain. Of course he would be drawn to a power like Naruto's. So you're one of his puppets. A collaborator in a grand design, Locus corrected her politely. Now, if you would be so kind as to surrender, anomaly, we can avoid any unnecessary unpleasantness. I have been instructed not to damage the specimen. Naruto bristled at being called a specimen. Yeah, well, I've got a message for your boss, he growled, dropping into a fighting stance. Tell him to stick his grand design up his. He never got to finish the sentence. The ground beneath him simply ceased to be. He was falling. Not into a pit, but into a disorienting, gray void. Soifon, reacting with incredible speed, shot forward with Shunpo to grab him, but the space between them stretched impossibly. She was moving at full speed, yet the distance to him grew, as if she were running on a treadmill. Clever, Locus noted from his perch. But futile. You cannot fight me in a world where I control the very definition of distance and direction. You are within my gallery now. Welcome to the Caja de Ecos, the echo box. The world fractured. Naruto landed hard on what felt like solid ground, but all around him was a swirling gray mist. He couldn't see Soifon. He couldn't see the Arankar. He couldn't see the sky. He was alone. Soifon found herself in a similar state, but her prison was a hall of mirrors. 1,000 reflections of herself stared back, each one perfectly mimicking her movements. She tried to feel for Naruto's energy, for the Arankars, but her senses were being bombarded with false echoes. 1,000 phantom presences that made it impossible to find the real one. Let's begin the assessment, Locus's voice whispered, seeming to come from her own reflection. The battle had begun, and it was a battle of perception. In his gray void, Naruto was assaulted by phantoms. Figures of pain, of Sasuke, of Jiraiya, lunged at him from the mist. He knew they were illusions, but they felt real. their attacks carrying weight and force. He dodged and weaved, his primordial aura flaring instinctively, erasing the constructs as they struck. But for every one he destroyed, two more would appear. Soifon's fight was more insidious. Her reflections began to move independently, attacking her with her own techniques. She was fighting herself, a dozen versions of her perfect, precise taijutsu coming at her from all angles. It was a test of impossible skill, forcing her to anticipate and counter her own moves. She was fast, but she couldn't be everywhere at once. A reflection's blade nicked her arm, drawing blood. The pain was real. These were not mere illusions, they were solid, spatial duplicates. Your movements are exquisite, Captain, Locus's voice purred. A perfect example of honed, disciplined power. But discipline relies on a consistent reality. What happens when the rules change every second? The floor beneath her feet suddenly became the ceiling. Gravity flipped, sending her tumbling through the mirrored space. She corrected herself in midair, using her spiritual power to adhere to a wall, but the disorientation was a critical weakness. Naruto was facing a similar problem. The void around him began to twist. The ground would ripple like water, or a phantom attack would come from a direction that physically shouldn't exist. He was fighting a battle on too many fronts. His mind struggling to keep up with an enemy who ignored the laws of physics. He was getting tired, the constant, low-level use of his nullification aura a steady drain on his stamina. He needed to break out. He needed to find the real enemy. He closed his eyes, shutting out the phantom attacks and the disorienting gray. He ignored the illusions and tried to feel for that fundamental wrongness. The core of the spatial distortion. He let his own power, his primordial sense, expand outward. He wasn't looking for a person. He was looking for the tear in the fabric of the world. And he found it. A single, sharp point of concentrated emptiness. The source. The puppeteer pulling the strings. It was everywhere and nowhere at once, the central axis around which this entire false reality was spinning. Found you, he whispered. He opened his eyes, now swirling with that familiar, cosmic light. He brought his hands together, not to form a jutsu, but to focus his will. He didn't try to attack Locus directly. He attacked the prison itself. He didn't pour power into a single point. He pushed outward in all directions, his goal simple: be real again. His aura exploded, not with force, but with a wave of absolute, unshakable order. It was a conceptual command, a denial of Locus's power. The gray mist around him dissolved like smoke in the wind. The swirling phantoms shattered into dust. The very fabric of the pocket dimension groaned, protesting this intrusion of fundamental law. In her hall of mirrors, Soifon felt the shift. The reflections flickered. The false echoes in her senses vanished, leaving only three distinct presences. Her own, Naruto's flaring power, and the Arankar. The walls of her prison began to crack, not like glass, but like reality itself, fissures of true empty space appearing in the air. With a final, ear-splitting screech of tearing space, the echo box shattered. They were back in the valley. But it was a ruin. The mesas were cracked, the ground was scorched. And in the center of it all, Locus was on one knee, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The porcelain plate over his eye was cracked, and a thin trickle of purple blood ran from beneath it. Maintaining his world against Naruto's raw, conceptual power had cost him dearly. Impossible, he choked out. You did not break my technique. You rewrote it. You imposed your own reality over mine. He looked up, his amethyst eye wide with a mixture of awe and terror. What are you? Before Naruto could answer, Locus's power flared again, but this time it was different. More desperate. More dangerous. If I cannot capture you, he snarled, then I will dissect you here and now. The space around Naruto compressed violently. It wasn't a physical pressure, it was a spatial one. The very atoms of his being were being forced together, the distance between them being deleted. It was a crushing, absolute force designed to implode him into a singularity. Naruto screamed, his aura flaring to its absolute limit to hold the compression at bay. He was fighting a war on a quantum level, his will against the Arankars, reality itself the battlefield. And in the heart of that struggle, as he pushed his power deeper than he ever had before, he saw it. His vision went black. The valley, Soifon, Locus, it all vanished. He was floating in an infinite void, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with a thick, roiling static, a visual and auditory hiss that felt like the sound of a billion dying stars. There was no up or down, no beginning or end. There was only the static. And in the center of it, a single, vast, unblinking eye. It wasn't malevolent. It wasn't angry. It was utterly, terrifyingly devoid of anything. It was the eye of a mindless god, a being of pure, absolute order, the order of perfect silence, of ultimate entropy. It was the god of static. And Naruto felt a horrifying, primal connection to it. The power he was wielding, it was a fragment of this thing. A lost piece of a cosmic horror that was now stirring in its slumber, awakened by the echoes of his own power. The vision lasted for only a fraction of a second, but it felt like an eternity. He was back in the valley. The crushing pressure still threatening to annihilate him. The vision had shaken him to his core, but it had also shown him the truth. His power wasn't a tool. It was a part of something vast and terrible. But it was his. Soifon. He yelled, his voice strained, his muscles trembling with the effort of holding reality together. He's focused on me. Create a path. Now. Soifon understood instantly. While Naruto was a living anchor, holding Locus's attention and power in a desperate stalemate, the space between her and the Arankar was stable, real. It was her chance. She exploded into motion, her shunpo leaving cracks in the stone beneath her feet. She was a black and white blur, a streak of silent, focused death. Locus's eye widened in panic. He tried to shift space, to put a wall between them. But his power was entirely dedicated to crushing Naruto. He was exposed. Soifon was on him in a heartbeat. Her stinger-like blade flickered, almost too fast to see, and tapped him once on the chest, leaving the black butterfly mark of her homunca. Homunca, she whispered, her face inches from his. Locus snarled, trying to lash out, but she was already gone, reappearing a safe distance away. He looked down at the mark, confused. It had been a negligible impact. Is that all, Shinigami? A tattoo? Soifon simply raised her gauntleted hand, her middle finger extended. Naigeki Kesatsu, she said. Her voice as cold and final as a tombstone. Locus's eyes widened as he finally understood. He looked back at her, a dawning horror on his face. But it was too late. He tried to speak, to retreat into a garganta, but the poison had already done its work. A dark stain spread rapidly from the butterfly mark, his body convulsing once before he fell, dissolving into dust that was scattered by the wind. The pressure on Naruto vanished so suddenly he stumbled forward, falling to his knees, gasping for air. The cosmic light in his eyes faded, leaving them a normal, exhausted blue. The world swam around him, the vision of the static and the eye burned into his mind. Soifon walked over to him, her expression grim. The fight was over, but the implications were just beginning. Aizen knows you exist, she said. He knows what you can do. He will send more, stronger ones. Naruto pushed himself to his feet, his body aching, his mind reeling. It's more than that, he said, his voice shaky. He looked at her, his eyes full of a new, terrifying knowledge. This power, it's not mine. It belongs to something else. Something. Sleeping. And I think we just woke it up. They stood in the ruined valley. Two soldiers from different worlds, bound by a battle they had barely survived. The internal threats of their own homes seemed almost insignificant now. They had looked into the abyss. And they had seen something looking back. The game had changed. The board was bigger than they had ever imagined, and they were standing right in the center of it. Chapter 4 End. Chapter 5. A Bridge of Souls and Scars. The walk back from the valley was a long, silent march through the deepening twilight. The adrenaline had long since faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. On in the phantom echo of a reality being crushed. Every step for Naruto was an effort of will. His body ached, but it was his mind that felt bruised, tenderized by the glimpse into the static-filled void. The image of that vast, unblinking eye was seared onto the back of his eyelids, a constant, silent hum beneath his thoughts. Soifon moved with her usual silent grace, but even she showed signs of the bottle's toll. There was a new tension in the set of her shoulders, a constant, searching motion in her eyes as she scanned the shadows. She wasn't just looking for shinobi ambushes or hollows anymore. She was looking for something else. Something that watched from the spaces in between. They were two soldiers retreating from a battle that had fundamentally changed the nature of the war. A war they hadn't even known they were fighting. "We can't go back to the village," Naruto said, his voice raspy. It was the first time either of them had spoken in over an hour. "Danzo's people will be waiting. And I can't face everyone right now." Soifon didn't argue. It was the logical conclusion. Returning to Konoha would be walking back into one trap while another, far greater one, was being set. "We need a secure location. To rest. To reassess." Naruto nodded, turning off the main path and heading deeper into the rising foothills of the mountains that bordered the Land of Fire. "I know a place. Somewhere my master used to take me. It's quiet." He led them for another hour, his steps sure even in the growing darkness, navigating the treacherous terrain from memory. The air grew cooler, scented with pine and damp earth. The only sound was the rush of a distant waterfall. He finally stopped at the base of a sheer cliff face, hidden behind a curtain of thick, ancient wisteria vines. Pushing them aside, he revealed a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. Inside, a natural tunnel sloped gently downwards, opening into a large, subterranean grotto. The air was warm and humid, filled with a gentle, billowing steam. In the center of the cavern was a large, natural pool of water, so clear it was like polished obsidian, with tendrils of steam rising from its surface into the cool air. Moonlight lanced down from a fissure high in the cavern ceiling, illuminating the water and casting the rest of the grotto in soft, deep shadows. It was a place of profound peace. A secret sanctuary hidden from the world. "Geothermal spring," Naruto explained, his voice low in the echoing space. Jiraiya-sensei said it was here since before the villages were founded. "Good for healing." He shrugged off his tattered jacket, the motion stiff and pained, and sat heavily on a smooth, flat rock at the water's edge. He winced as he moved, a long, shallow cut on his arm reopening. A thin line of red welling up on his skin. Soifon watched him, her expression a mask of neutrality. She remained standing, a coiled spring of readiness in the peaceful grotto. She was a weapon in a place of healing. And the contrast was stark. Naruto peeled off his shirt, revealing a latticework of cuts and bruises from the fight. He dipped a strip of cloth from his pack into the hot water and began to clumsily clean the gash on his arm. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, broken only by the gentle lapping of the water and his sharp intake of breath as he cleaned the wound. "Why are you so loyal to them?" he asked, his voice quiet, not looking at her. The question was so abrupt, so out of the blue, it seemed to hang in the steam-filled air. Soifon stiffened. "To whom?" "Your bosses," he clarified. His gaze fixed on his arm. "The head captain. The Gote 13. You follow their orders without question, even when they tell you to come to another world and kill a kid you've never met." "Why?" Her first instinct was to give the textbook answer. "It is my duty. Order is paramount. The stability of the Soul Society is my only concern." But the words felt hollow. Anadaku. 8 after what they had just faced together. The neat, ordered world those words described felt a universe away from the reality-bending horror of Locus and the terrifying vision Naruto had described. "The Gote 13 is the pillar that supports the world," she said, her voice tight. "Without its laws, its discipline, its strength, the Soul Society would crumble into chaos. Millions of souls would be lost. My loyalty is to that order. It is the only thing that stands between us and oblivion." "But what if the order is wrong?" Naruto pressed, finally looking up at her. His blue eyes were serious, stripped of their usual boisterous energy. "What if following the rules means letting something worse happen? Like Danzo getting his hands on me, or Aizen. Your orders were to observe me, maybe kill me. But that Urankar, he would have been a bigger threat to everyone than I could ever be. You broke your orders to help me. Why?" The question was a scalpel, cutting straight to the heart of the conflict raging within her. She had been asking herself the same thing. Her logical mind had supplied a strategic reason, eliminating a more immediate threat. But she knew, in the silent, honest corners of her soul, that it was more than that. Watching Danzo's soulless puppets try to dissect him, seeing Aizen's cold, clinical cruelty manifested in Locus, it had stirred something within her. A fierce, protective instinct that was entirely at odds with her programming. "My decision was a tactical one," she said, her voice colder than it needed to be. Your uncontrolled power combined with Danzo's ambi. Tion was a greater variable of risk than your continued existence. For now. Naruto snorted, a dry, humorless sound. Right. Tactical. You always have an answer, don't you? You're like a perfect, pointy little machine. Do you ever just feel something and go with it? Her control snapped. Do not presume to understand me, boy, she hissed, her voice dangerously low. She took a step closer, her spiritual pressure flaring for a moment. A wave of cold, sharp energy that made the air crackle. You speak of loyalty as if it's a simple choice, a warm feeling in your gut. My loyalty was forged in the harshest fires. It was sworn to a person who was the living embodiment of the order I protect. She was my mentor, my commander, my goddess. She was the fastest, strongest, most brilliant warrior the Soul Society had ever known. And one day, she vanished. She abandoned her post, her duties, her rank, and me. Without a word, without a reason. The confession hung in the air, raw and bleeding. She didn't say Yoruichi's name. But she didn't have to. The pain was a living thing in her voice, a wound over a century old that had never properly healed. So I learned the truth, she continued, her voice regaining its icy composure. But the tremor of emotion was still there. Loyalty to a person is a fool's game. People leave. People betray. People die. But the law, the order, the Gote 13 itself, that is eternal. That is something that will never abandon you. I am loyal to the institution, not the individuals within it. It is a loyalty that cannot be betrayed. Naruto stared at her, his own troubles forgotten. He wasn't seeing a cold-hearted assassin. He was seeing a girl, younger than he was, standing in the ruins of her entire world after the person she admired most had walked away and left her there alone. He knew that feeling better than anyone. It was the story of his life. He didn't offer pity. He didn't say, I'm sorry. He just nodded slowly, his expression full of a quiet, profound understanding that was more comforting than any platitude. Yeah, he said softly. That sucks. 3 simple words. Not of sympathy, but of pure, unadulterated empathy. And they disarmed her more effectively than any attack. The defensive wall of ice around her cracked. She looked away, unable to meet his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her stony facade. He turned back to his arm, dabbing at the cut. The silence returned, but it was different now. Less tense. More companionable. A bridge of shared scars had been built between them in the quiet grotto. Seeing him fumbling with the makeshift bandage, she let out an exasperated sigh. You're doing it all wrong. You'll get an infection. She walked over, knelt beside him, and took the cloth from his hand. Her touch was surprisingly gentle, her movements efficient and precise as she expertly cleaned and bound the wound. He watched her, the focused frown on her face, the way her dark hair fell across her shoulder. He was so close he could feel the faint, cold aura of her spiritual pressure, a stark contrast to the warmth of her hands on his skin. This power of yours, she said, her voice losing its edge, becoming more clinical. More curious. The vision you saw. This, God of static. Tell me everything. So he did. He told her about the infinite void, the hissing static, the terrifyingly empty eye. He told her about the feeling of connection, the horrifying realization that the power he wielded wasn't a gift, but a broken piece of a slumbering cosmic entity. I'm not a Jinchuriki anymore, he whispered. The confession costing him more than he could say. Jinchuriki have a tailed beast sealed inside them. A prison. This is different. I feel like I am the prison. And the prisoner is starting to wake up. What if I can't hold it? What if one day I just break, and this thing gets out? It was his deepest fear, laid bare. The fear that he wasn't a hero, but a time bomb. A monster waiting to happen. Soifon finished tying off the bandage, her fingers lingering for a moment on his arm. She looked at his face, at the genuine terror in his eyes. The boy who had faced down gods and monsters was afraid of himself. Then we will not let it, she said, her voice quiet but firm. The word we hung in the air between them. It was an acknowledgement, an acceptance, a promise. For the first time, she was not speaking as a captain of the Gote 13 assessing a threat. She was speaking as a warrior to her comrade. In a place that was not a place, in a time that was not a time, the arbiter observed. It existed in a dimension of pure information, a crystalline reality of interlocking geometric patterns and silent, flowing light. It had no eyes, but it saw. It had no ears, but it heard. It perceived the universe as a grand, intricate equation, and it was a guardian of that equation's integrity. It had been monitoring the fragment designated Naruto Uzumaki since its awakening. The fragment was a significant breach of cosmic law, a piece of the Great Silence, the god of static, that had been shattered in an ancient war before worlds were given names. The fragments were meant to be inert, echoes of a nullified power. But this one had become active. It had bonded with a sentient organic being, and the result was an unprecedented level of reality warping instability. Now, it observed a new, alarming development. It watched the scene in the grotto, not as a visual image, but as a flow of data. It saw the two energy signatures, the chaotic, primordial power of the fragment and the cold, ordered Raryoku of the Shinigami. But it also perceived a third energy, a subtle, resonant frequency forming between them. The arbiter's internal lexicon struggled to classify it. The close, saint translation was emotional resonance, empathy, trust, a bond. And this bond was having a catastrophic effect on the fragment. The data streams were terrifyingly clear. The emotional connection was acting as a stabilizing agent. It was giving the raw, chaotic power a structure, a framework to operate within. It was helping the host, Naruto, to unconsciously understand and refine his control. The contagion was not just active. It was evolving. It was learning. The host's emotions were the catalyst. The arbiter, a being of pure, dispassionate logic, came to a swift and unavoidable conclusion. The initial strategy, to observe, and if necessary, dispatch a low-level cleaner like the ones that had previously erased historical records, was no longer viable. The threat had escalated beyond standard quarantine protocols. A silent, data-rich communique was broadcast from the arbiter to a higher authority, a council of its brethren hibernating in the heart of a neutron star. The message was concise and absolute. Less than fragment designation. Uzumaki, Naruto. Status. Active, self-aware, evolving. Contagion catalyst identified. Emotional bonding with native entity designation. Soifon. Prognosis. Uncontrolled cascade failure of local reality imminent. Standard protocols insufficient. Recommending activation of purification protocol. Target. The fragment and all resonant entities. Erase the equation. Erase the world. Greater than. Back in the grotto, a sudden, inexplicable chill swept through the warm air. It was a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a deep, primal cold that felt like the heat death of the universe. Naruto and Soifon both felt it. They looked up, half expecting to see a new enemy, but there was nothing. Only the moonlight, the steam, and the quiet lapping of the water. But the moment of peace was gone. The sanctuary no longer felt safe. They were being watched. Not by Danzo, not by Aizen, but by something far older, far colder, and infinitely more patient. Soifon stood up, her hand returning to her Zanpakuto. Her moral dilemma had vanished, burned away by the heat of a new, terrifying certainty. Her mission was no longer about Konoha or the Soul Society. It was no longer about following orders. The true enemy wasn't Naruto. The true enemy was the thing that owned his power. And Naruto, the boy she had been sent to kill, might be the only weapon in existence that could fight it. Her duty was clear. It was no longer to eliminate the anomaly. It was to protect the vessel. Naruto looked at her, seeing the new, hard resolve in her eyes. He felt it too. The time for hiding and reacting was over. He couldn't outrun the god sleeping in his soul. He had to turn and face it. And this cold, deadly woman from another world, who spoke of loyalty to laws instead of people but whose actions proved otherwise, was the only person in any world he could trust to have his back. Their alliance was no longer one of convenience or necessity. It was a pact, sealed in a sacred grotto over shared wounds and a shared glimpse into the abyss. They were no longer just a shinobi and a soul reaper. They were the first and only line of defense against the coming silence. Chapter 5 End. Chapter 6. The Captain's Gambit. The return to the Soul Society was like stepping from a raging bonfire into a vacuum-sealed chamber. The chaotic, vibrant life energy of the elemental nations vanished, replaced by the sterile, oppressive stillness of the Seraite. Here, every soul had its place, Every particle of reishi was accounted for, and the air itself hummed with the weight of 1,000 years of rigid, unbending law. For the first time in her life, the order she had so fiercely defended felt suffocating. It felt like a cage. Soifon stood alone in the 2nd Division barracks. The familiar scent of clean wood and ozone doing nothing to calm the tempest in her mind. She had left Naruto hidden in the grotto, a sanctuary that felt terrifyingly temporary. They had a plan, or rather, the desperate skeleton of one. She would return and report, reframe the narrative, and buy them time. He would wait for her signal. It was a flimsy strategy built on a foundation of lies and a desperate hope that she could manipulate the most powerful military force in existence. She had to lie. The thought was a shard of glass in her gut. She, who had rebuilt her entire identity around the unshakable pillars of duty and truth, was about to stand before the Captain Commander and the assembled Gote 13 and construct a fortress of deception. She would omit details, twist facts, and praise a version of events so carefully edited it was functionally a work of fiction. She would do it to protect the very anomaly she had been ordered to eliminate. The hypocrisy was a bitter, metallic taste in her mouth. She was betraying her principles, her commander, and the law she held sacred. And for what? For a loud, emotionally volatile boy from another world who possessed a power that could unmake reality. A boy who had looked at her, not as a captain or an assassin, but as a person, and had understood the century-old ache of her abandonment with 3 simple words. That sucks. It was illogical. It was sentimental. It was a catastrophic tactical error. And yet, she knew with an unshakable certainty that it was the only correct move. The vision Naruto described, the god of static, had changed the equation. That was the true threat. Aizen, Danzo, they were merely predators fighting over a carcass. The god of static was the coming ice age that would freeze them all. And Naruto, for better or worse, was the heart of that storm. Protecting him wasn't a betrayal of her duty, it was the ultimate fulfillment of it. She was protecting the world, even if she had to lie to its guardians to do so. With her resolve hardened into a cold, sharp point, she stepped out of her barracks and headed for the 1st Division headquarters. The summons had already been sent. The captains were waiting. The air in the assembly hall was thick with spiritual pressure, a palpable sea of power emanating from the 13 most powerful souls in the Seraite. They stood in 2 neat lines, a gallery of living legends and monsters. At the head of the room, seated on the simple wooden floor, was Head Captain Yamamoto, his eyes closed, his ancient form radiating an authority that was as absolute as gravity. Soifon walked the length of the hall, her footsteps the only sound in the cavernous space. She could feel their eyes on her, feel their power washing over her. She could read their dispositions like a book. Captain Unohana's gentle, placid smile hid an abyss of power. Byakuya Kuchiki's face was a mask of aristocratic indifference, his very presence a judgment. Zaraki Kenpachi leaned on his jagged Zanpakuto, a manic, bloodthirsty grin already spreading across his face in anticipation of a good story. And Mayuri Kuretsuchi was practically vibrating, his golden eyes wide with a predatory, scientific glee. She knelt in the center of the room, her head bowed. Captain of the 2nd Division, Soifon, reporting as ordered. Yamamoto's voice rumbled, the sound of mountains grinding together. You were dispatched to the dimension designated, Elemental Prime 7 feet to assess a cosmological anomaly. Your report. This was it. The moment of truth. Soifon took a slow, steadying breath. Head Captain. The anomaly is a sentient being. A human male, 16 years of age, named Naruto Uzumaki. Mayuri let out a theatrical, disappointed sigh. A human. How pedestrian. I was hoping for something more exotic. Still, the energy signature is unprecedented. Did you bring it back as instructed? I have a new dissection table I'm eager to christen. I did not, Captain Kuretsuchi, Soifon said, not looking at him. Because my assessment revealed a situation far more complex and dangerous than a simple energy signature. She began her carefully constructed narrative. She described Naruto's power, not as a primordial force of creation, but as an unstable, highly volatile form of energy manipulation, unlike any chakra or Raryoku she had ever witnessed. She detailed his victory over the being called pain, framing it not as a controlled act, but as a desperate, cataclysmic eruption that he barely survived. She was painting a picture of a nuclear bomb with a faulty trigger, a boy barely in control of a power that could level a country. The boy himself is not inherently hostile, she continued, choosing her words with surgical precision. He is emotionally driven, impulsive, and fiercely protective of his home and comrades. His will, however, is not yet strong enough to fully command the power he contains. So he is a threat, Byakuya Kuchiki stated, his voice cold and clipped. An unstable weapon in the hands of a child. Your orders were clear, Captain Soifon. If the threat was uncontrollable, it was to be eliminated. Why is he still alive? Because he is not the only threat, Captain Kuchiki, Soifon shot back. Lifting her head to meet his gaze, her own eyes like chips of obsidian. During my reconnaissance, I confirmed two other significant developments. First, the TRA. Atur Sosuke Aizen is aware of the boy's existence and power. A ripple of tension went through the room. The name Aizen was a fresh, deep wound. Aizen dispatched a high-level Arankar to capture him, she went on. The creature's abilities involved advanced spatial manipulation, a power that far exceeded what we have previously encountered. I was forced to intervene. The boy and I fought together to defeat it. This, at least, was mostly true. Aizen does not see the boy as a threat. He sees him as a key. A tool to be used in his own ascension. If we make an enemy of Naruto Uzumaki, we risk pushing him directly into Aizen's arms. The logic was sound, and she could see it landing. Even Byakuya's impassive face tightened slightly. The thought of Aizen possessing a weapon of this magnitude was a chilling one. And the second development? Captain Yukitaki asked, his gentle voice a welcome reprieve from the tension. The Arankar was not the only external entity drawn by the boy's power, Soifon said. Moving into the most crucial part of her gambit. This had to be believable. I detected other presences. Faint, cold, and utterly alien. They do not feel like hollows or any spiritual being I have ever encountered. They are watchers, drawn to the boy like moths to a flame. I believe Aizen is a secondary threat. The true danger is this new, unknown variable. She was weaving the silent arbiters into her story, framing them as a mysterious new enemy faction. It was a lie built around a terrifying truth. She concluded, her voice ringing with a conviction that was so real because, at its core, it was. To attempt to eliminate Naruto Uzumaki now would be a catastrophic mistake. His power is too volatile. A direct assault could trigger an extinction-level event. Worse, it would remove a critical piece from the board. A potential counter to Aizen and this new enemy. He is not a target to be neutralized. He is a strategic asset to be secured. Or, at the very least, an ally to be cultivated. The silence that followed was deafening. She had just proposed an alliance with the very thing she'd been sent to destroy. The uproar was immediate. Preposterous. Mayuri shrieked, his voice rising in pitch. An asset. He is a specimen. A unique biological and spiritual event. His value lies on my examination table, not as some brutish ally. You had a direct order, Captain, and you have failed spectacularly. To ally with such a disorderly and unpredictable being is an insult to the law, Byakuya added, his voice dripping with contempt. He is no different from the Ryoka Ichigo Kurosaki. A disruption to the natural order. He should be apprehended and sealed, not coddled. Heh heh heh. A low, rumbling chuckle cut through the arguments. Zaraki Kenpachi's grin had stretched from ear to ear. His eyes gleaming with pure, unadulterated joy. So this kid is strong enough to get Aizen's attention, strong enough to fight one of his pets, and you think trying to kill him would blow up a country? Sounds like my kind of fight. Bring him here. I'll test him. Soifon stood her ground against the barrage of arguments, her posture unyielding. She had expected this. She had planned for it. Your desire for a fight is irrelevant, Captain Zaraki, she said, her tone sharp. And your desire for a new toy is equally so, Captain Kuritsuchi. This is a matter of strategy, not personal gratification. Sealing him, as you suggest, Captain Kuchiki, assumes he can be sealed. What conventional Kido or seal could possibly contain a power that can unmake reality itself? Her words hit their mark, a cold dose of reality. The captains fell silent again, considering the implications. A power that could nullify their own techniques. A weapon that could ignore their defenses. It was a terrifying thought. Finally, Yamamoto opened his eyes. The sheer pressure that rolled off him silenced all remaining dissent. The air grew heavy, hot, like the moments before a lightning strike. He stared at Soifon, his ancient gaze seeming to strip away her lies, to see the truth cowering beneath. Your report is compelling, Captain Soifon, he rumbled. You have always been one of our most logical and duty-bound captains. This deviation from your orders is noteworthy. He paused, letting the unspoken accusation hang in the air. You speak of strategy, but your voice carries the fire of personal conviction. You are hiding something. Soifon's blood ran cold. He knew. However, Yamamoto continued, his gaze unwavering, the threat of Aizen acquiring such a power, and the potential emergence of a new enemy, cannot be ignored. Your logic, at least, is sound. He closed his eyes again. The Gote 13 will take no official action regarding the anomaly at this time. We will observe. For our emotional involvement in this matter, you are hereby relieved of your duties as lead investigator. You are confined to the Seraite pending a full review. This matter is concluded. It was not a victory. But it was not a defeat. It was a reprieve. She had been sidelined, placed under suspicion, her honor questioned. But she had bought Naruto time. For now, the might of the Gote 13 would not be coming for him. She bowed deeply. As you command, head captain. As Soifon was fighting her political battle, Naruto was moving through the shadows of his own home. He had returned to Konoha under the cloak of night. A ghost in the village he had saved. A deep, instinctual need had driven him back. He couldn't just leave. He had to see it one last time. He moved silently across the rooftops of the still rebuilding village. His heart a heavy lump in his chest. He passed Ichiraku Ramen, its new sign glowing warmly in the night. He saw the faint light on in Sakura's temporary apartment and D felt a pang of longing for a simpler time, a time when his biggest problem was getting her to go on a date with him. He was heading for the Hokage's office, hoping to see Tsunade, to somehow say goodbye without words. When he heard voices coming from a nearby council chamber, he recognized them instantly. The reedy, cautious tones of the village elders, Homura and Kaharu. He flattened himself against the wall, suppressing his presence, and listened. The reports from Danzo's surviving men are terrifying, Homura was saying. The boy's power didn't just defeat them, it nullified their jutsu. It warped the very space around them. This is beyond the Kyuubi. It is beyond anything we have ever seen. He is unstable. Kaharu's voice was sharp, brittle with fear. Tsunade's sentimentality blinds her. She still sees the boy, not the weapon. And it is a broken weapon. It cannot be controlled. It cannot be aimed. It can only be put down. Danzo's method of capture and re-education is too risky, Homura mused. If he fails again, he may provoke the very catastrophe we are trying to avoid. No, we need a more permanent solution. A gentler one. Naruto's blood ran cold. He knew what was coming. The Uzumaki clan's five-pronged soul seal, Kaharu said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was designed for Jinchuriki who had lost their minds, a failsafe to decommission them without killing them. It doesn't just seal away chakra. It severs the connection between the spirit and the power itself. It would leave him placid. The power would become dormant, the boy would be rendered harmless. He would live out his days in peace. It is a mercy. A mercy. They were talking about spiritually lobotomizing him. Erasing everything he was, everything he had fought to become, and calling it a kindness. It wasn't about protecting the village from a threat. It was about cleaning up a problem. Putting a tool that was too sharp back in a box, forever. The last, fragile thread that tied him to this place. To this life, snapped. Soifon had been right. He was not safe here. He was not a hero to them. He was a problem. A broken weapon. He had bled for this village. He had died for this village. And they were plotting to erase his soul and call it a mercy. A cold, hard clarity washed over him. His path was not here. His home was no longer his home. His loyalty, which he had given so freely, had been repaid with fear and betrayal. He had one ally in all the worlds, and she was in another dimension, risking everything for him. His choice was clear. He pushed himself away from the wall. The voices of the elders fading behind him like the whispers of ghosts. He moved through the village one last time, his steps now filled with a grim, unwavering purpose. He stopped at the base of the Hokage monument, looking up at the stone faces of the leaders who had come before. He looked at the face of his father, a man who had burdened him with this power, this life, in the Hokage that he would one day be seen as a hero. Sorry, Dad, he whispered to the stone face. I guess they just weren't ready. He turned his back on the monument, on the village, on his entire life up to that point. He was no longer Naruto Uzumaki of the Hidden Leaf. He was just Naruto. And he was going to find his own path. He headed for the forests at the edge of the village, his destination a world away. His fight was just beginning. Chapter 6 End. Chapter 7. A Fox in the Soul Palace. The world had shrunk to the size of the moonlit grotto. For 3 days, Naruto existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting. He trained. But his movements were mechanical, his mind elsewhere. He would sit by the steaming pool for hours, trying to reach inside himself, to understand the silent, static LLED abyss that now constituted his soul. He was chasing a ghost in his own house, and the silence that answered was more terrifying than any roar. The fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in his stomach. The fear of what he was. And the fear of what would happen if the fragile truce he'd forged with Soifon failed. She was his only lifeline. A single, sharp, deadly anchor in a universe that had suddenly grown impossibly large and hostile. He thought about her constantly, not with the foolish, schoolboy crush he'd had on Sakura, but with a desperate, gravitational pull. He replayed her words, her movements. The surprising vulnerability in her eyes when she spoke of her past. She was as broken as he was, but she had taken her broken pieces and forged them into a weapon. He had just been letting his shatter him. On the evening of the 3rd day, it came. A ripple in the air of the grotto, a flicker of black and gold. A single hell butterfly, its wings beating with an unnatural silence, fluttered down and landed on his outstretched finger. It wasn't a message of words. It was a surge of pure, cold Raryoku, a burst of coded intent that his own power somehow translated. It was her signature, her essence, and a single, complex concept. Trust the man with the hat and clogs. It's time. The butterfly dissolved into particles of black and gold light. Naruto stood, his heart pounding. The waiting was over. He took one last look at the peaceful grotto, a sanctuary he knew he could never return to, and stepped out into the night, leaving the land of fire behind him forever. Follow. Wing the butterfly's lingering energy trail was an exercise in his new senses. It wasn't a scent or a visual path, but a faint, resonant hum in the fabric of reality, a breadcrumb trail left on a levee of existence he was only just beginning to perceive. It led him out of the mountains, through the dense, sleeping forests, and into the bustling, chaotic outskirts of a small, nondescript port town in the land of tea. And there, sitting nonchalantly atop a stack of cargo crates and fanning himself in the humid night air, was the most out-of-place man he had ever seen. He wore a dark green shihakusho, a striped bucket hat that shadowed his face, and traditional wooden clogs, or geta. He looked up as Naruto approached, a lazy, enigmatic smile on his face. This had to be the guy. Well, the man said. His voice light and cheerful, though his eyes, sharp and intelligent in the shadows of his hat, missed nothing. You must be the big emergency. Honestly, from the tone of Soifon's little message, I was expecting something a bit more on fire. You're the man with the hat and clogs? Naruto asked, his hand resting instinctively on his kunai pouch. This man's energy was bizarre. It felt powerful, but it was layered and masked, like a dozen locked boxes stacked inside one another. The one and only, the man snapped his fan shut with a flick of his wrist. Kazuki Urahara, at your service. Former captain of the 12th Division, humble proprietor of a small candy shop, and professional meddler in affairs that are far too dangerous for my own good. And you? He hopped down from the crates, his clogs making a soft clatter on the stone dock, are Naruto Uzumaki. The walking, talking cosmological paradox. It's a pleasure to finally meet the source of all the fuss. Naruto was taken aback. You know who I am. Oh, I know everything, Urahara said with a wave of his fan. It's a terrible habit. Now, Soifon was very emphatic. She needs you in the Soul Society, and she nay. Eds you there in a way that's going to make a very big, very loud splash. Apparently, subtlety is off the table. His smile widened, becoming a little more manic. Which, I have to say, makes things much more fun for me. He led Naruto to a secluded warehouse at the edge of the docks. The inside was a chaotic jumble of strange inventions, arcane charts, and shelves overflowing with soul candy. In the center of the floor was a massive, ornate gate, the Senkaimon. Alright, here's the plan, Urahara said, his tone shifting from jovial to businesslike in an instant. Soifon is currently under house arrest. Bless her little black ops heart. She can't help you on arrival. The Gote 13 is on high alert, but they're expecting a threat, not a, well, you. If you just walk in, they'll surround you, seal you, and hand you over to Mayuri Kuretsuchi for a series of excruciatingly inventive experiments. We don't want that. No, we need to bypass the welcome wagon entirely. He gestured to the gate. This Senkaimon is of my own design. It's a little temperamental. It won't open into the designated entry zone. Instead, I've aimed it at what we might call a low security area. Now, aimed is a strong word. It's more like a general suggestion of a destination. It's going to be a rough ride. And your arrival will be energetic. What does that mean? Naruto asked, eyeing the ominous gate. Quote, it means hold on tight and try not to land on anyone important, Urahara said with a cheerful grin. Oh, and one more thing. He tossed a small, metallic object to Naruto, who caught it instinctively. It was a small, black earring. Shaped like a tiny, stylized bird. It's a Keto transmitter. Soifon's idea. Once you're inside, put it on. It'll let her speak to you, guide you. It's keyed to her Ryutsu and shielded from detection. Clever girl. Now, any last words before you're shot out of a cannon into a fortress of angry demigods? Naruto looked at the earring in his hand, then back at Urahara. There was no turning back now. Just tell her I'm on my way. Urahara's smile softened for a fraction of a second. She knows. Good luck, Naruto Uzumaki. You're going to need it. With that, he SLAMMED his palm onto a seal beside the gate. With a deafening roar and a blast of compressed air, the Senkaimon's doors flew open, revealing not a clean passageway, but a swirling, chaotic vortex of screaming souls and violent energy. All aboard! Urahara shouted over the din. Naruto took a deep breath, clenched his fists, and ran headlong into the storm. The Seraite was a bastion of tranquility. Its white gravel paths were perfectly raked, its towering walls stood as a testament to eternal order, and the air was still with the calm of 1,000 years. This tranquility was abruptly and violently shattered. High above the barracks of the 11th Division, the sky tore open. Not with the ragged black gash of a garganta, but with a violent, screeching rupture of space itself. A vortex of unstable energy vomited a single, orange-clad figure into the sky. Naruto tumbled through the air, the world a confusing blur of white and blue, before crashing into the tiled roof of the 11th Ain barracks with the force of a small meteor. The roof exploded inwards, sending a shower of shattered tiles, splintered wood, and dust into the courtyard below. He landed in the center of the yard with a ground-shaking thud, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. For a moment, there was a stunned, absolute silence. Then, the yard, which had been filled with 100 or so of the most battle-crazed, bloodthirsty thugs in the Soul Society, erupted. What in the hell was that? Did a building just fall on us? It's a person. Look. As the dust settled, they saw him. A blonde-haired kid in a torn orange jacket, pushing himself up from a crater of his own making, groaning. Akaku Madarame, 3rd seat of the 11th Division, was the first to react. His bald head gleamed in the sunlight, a wide, predatory grin spreading across his face. Well, now, look what the sky spat out. An invader. And he came straight to our front door. How polite. He looks strong. Yumachika Yasugawa, the 5th seat, commented from the sidelines, idly preening a stray feather on his uniform. Or at least, he's very durable. That landing should have turned him into a paste. Naruto shook his head, trying to clear the ringing in his ears. He remembered Urahara's instructions, fumbling for the earring and quickly clipping it to his left ear. A second later, a voice, sharp and frantic, echoed directly in his mind. Naruto. You idiot. Are you alright? I felt that explosion from halfway across the Seraite. Urahara was supposed to give you a soft landing. This is soft. He thought back, wincing as he got to his feet. I think he tried to kill me. Where am I? The worst possible place. Soifon's voice was grim. The 11th Division Barracks. The combat specialists. They live for battle. Do not, under any circumstances, provoke them. Too late. Akaku was already striding towards him, cracking his knuckles. Alright, invader boy. You've got 3 seconds to tell us who you are and why you desi. Dead to demolish our roof before I use your skull to patch the hole. 1. Naruto held up his hands. Look, I don't want any trouble. I'm here too. 2. Akaku interrupted, breaking into a run. Naruto, you have to stop him. But don't cripple him. Soifon's voice was a sharp command in his head. Show strength, but not enough to be seen as an immediate, world-ending threat. It was an impossible needle to thread. Naruto sidestepped Akaku's charging punch, the bigger man's fist whistling past his ear. He didn't counterattack. He just kept dodging, weaving through a flurry of powerful, if clumsy, punches and kicks. The surrounding members of the 11th Division started cheering and jeering, forming a rough circle around the two. Stand still and fight me, you coward. Akaku roared. I'm really trying not to. Naruto grunted, ducking under a wide swing. This couldn't continue. He needed to end this quickly. The next time Akaku lunged, Naruto didn't dodge. He stood his ground. He focused, just for a second, on the patch of ground directly beneath Akaku's leading foot. He didn't will it to do anything spectacular. He just made it soft. Akaku's foot, expecting solid earth, sank 6 inches into the ground as if it had suddenly turned into thick mud. His balance was instantly, catastrophically gone. He pitched forward, his attack ruined, a look of pure shock on his face. Naru, to simply stepped aside and stuck out his own foot, tripping the off-balance Shinigami, who went down with a loud, undignified crash. The yard fell silent. No one had ever seen Akaku Madarame defeated by being tripped. Akaku lay face down for a second before pushing himself up, his face a mask of furious disbelief. What was that? What did you do? Before he could get up, a shadow fell over the entire courtyard. An immense spiritual pressure, a tidal wave of bloodlust and raw, joyous power, washed over them all, making the very air thick and hard to breathe. The cheering of the 11th Division died instantly, replaced by reverent silence. Now, Akaku, a deep, gravelly voice drawled. Is that any way to treat a guest who was nice enough to drop in? Captain Zaraki Kenpachi stood on the ruined edge of the roof, his huge frame blotting out the sun. His black captain's haori was draped over his scarred, muscular shoulders, and his jagged zanpakuto was propped on his shoulder. His eye-patched gaze was fixed on Naruto. And his face was stretched into the widest, most terrifyingly happy grin Naruto had ever seen. You, Kenpachi said, his voice a low rumble of excitement. You're the one Soifon was talking about. Aren't you? The anomaly. The one who might just be strong enough to give me a real fight. He didn't wait for an answer. He leapt from the roof, the ground shaking as he landed, and his zanpakuto. A blade that looked more like a sharpened slab of iron, swung at Naruto in a lazy, almost casual arc. It was anything but casual. Naruto felt a hurricane of killing, intent and raw power coming off the blade. His instincts screamed. He didn't have time to dodge. His primordial aura flared to life, a passive, invisible shield of warped space forming in front of him. The blade struck the shield. There was no clang of metal on metal. There was a deep, resonant thrum, as if a giant bell had been struck. The air shimmered. Kenpachi's unstoppable blade had been stopped by nothing. He was brought to a dead halt, a look of wild, ecstatic surprise on his face. Ha, ha 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 ha. Kenpachi's laugh was a booming, joyous roar that shook the very foundations of the barracks. Yes, you are. You're the one. This is going to be fun. The alarm bells of the Seraite began to shriek, a piercing wail that signaled an invasion. Within minutes, the courtyard was surrounded. Captains and lieutenants began to arrive via shunpo, their faces grim. Byakuya Kuchiki, Toshiro Hitsugaya, Sajin Komamura. They formed a perimeter, their hands on their zanpakuto, their combined spi. Ritual pressure turning the yard into a pressure cooker. At the same time, in the 1st Division Assembly Hall, Yamamoto slammed the butt of his cane on the floor, the sound cracking like thunder. Report. An officer skidded into the room, bowing so low his forehead touched the floor. Captain Commander. A Ryoka has breached the Seraite. He appeared directly inside the 11th Division compound. Captain Zaraki is engaging him now. Yamamoto's visible eye narrowed to a slit. Soifon's pet monster had come to them. He had either been lured, or he was more foolish than he had imagined. Summon Captain Soifon. Now. A few minutes later, Soifon was escorted into the hall. She knelt, her face a perfect mask of calm. Captain Soifon, Yamamoto's voice was dangerously low. Your strategic asset has just invaded my home. Explain yourself. Head Captain, I can assure you I did not, she began, but Yamamoto cut her off. I do not care for your assurances, he growled. He is here. He is fighting one of my captains. This act of aggression will be met with the full force of the Gote 13. We will overwhelm him, capture him, and he will be handed over to the 12th Division for vivisection. This was it. The plan was spiraling out of control. Soifon's mind raced, searching for an angle, a way to salvage the situation. She had to use their own rules against them. Head Captain, I urge you to reconsider, she said. Her voice clear and strong, betraying none of her inner panic. You yourself said we should observe. What better way to observe his power, to gauge its limits and his control, than in a controlled environment? Captain Zaraki is already engaging him. This is not an invasion. This is an opportunity. Mayuri Kuritsuchi cackled with glee. Oh, I like this. A live combat experiment. Much better than a dead specimen. We can gather real-time data on his capabilities. A public duel is a mockery of our laws, Byakuya interjected, his voice like ice. No, Soifon countered, standing up. Her gaze sweeping across the few captains present. It is a trial. A trial by combat. Let him face Captain Zaraki. If he is truly the uncontrollable monster you fear, Captain Zaraki will put him down. If he is not, if he can demonstrate strength and control, then we will have our answer. And we will have a powerful new piece on the board in the war against Aizen. We turn this chaos into a calculated assessment. Yamamoto was silent for a long, tense moment, stroking his beard. The logic was, once again, infuriatingly sound. A full-scale battle in the middle of the Seraite would cause immense collateral damage. A one-on-one duel could be contained. It would satisfy Zaraki's bloodlust, Mayuri's curiosity, and provide them all with invaluable intelligence. And in the end, if the boy failed, he would be dead. Very well, he rumbled, his voice final. Let the trial proceed. Inform all personnel to stand down and observe. Let us see what this anomaly can truly do. Back in the courtyard, the standoff was broken by Yamamoto's command, delivered via Hell Butterfly to every captain on the scene. The perimeter widened, the other captains moving back to give the two combatants room. It was no longer a skirmish. It was a formal duel. A spectacle. Naruto, can you hear me? Soifon's voice was urgent in his ear. The situation has changed. This is a trial now. You can't just survive. You have to win. But you have to win with control. Don't try to match his power. Outthink him. Use your ability in ways he can't predict. He's all power and instinct. You have to be strategy and precision. You have to prove you're more than just a monster. Naruto looked at Kenpachi, who was practically vibrating with excitement. The man's spiritual pressure was a physical force, pressing down on him. Screaming with the promise of a glorious death. Outthink him. Right. All right, kid. No more interruptions. Kenpachi roared, hefting his sword. Let's get this party started. Fight me. He charged. And the real battle began. Kenpachi was not like Akaku. His movements were not clumsy. They were brutally direct, each swing of his massive blade carrying enough force to cleave a mountain. Naruto was forced onto the defensive, his primordial aura working overtime. He didn't create a solid shield. He created micro-distortions, small pockets of warped space that would meet the blade's edge, deflecting it just enough to avoid a fatal blow. To the onlookers, it looked like he was dodging by a hair's breadth every time, a dance of impossible luck. His right side is over. Exposed when he uses that downward slash. Soifon's voice coached. He relies on his spiritual pressure to act as a shield. Find a way through it. Find a way through a tsunami of raw power. Easy for her to say. Naruto ducked under a wide, horizontal swing that cut a deep gouge into the barracks wall behind him. He needed an opening. He needed to do something Kenpachi wouldn't expect. As Kenpachi raised his sword for another devastating overhead chop, Naruto slapped his palms on the ground. He focused, not on attacking, but on the very concept of grip. He willed the ground beneath Kenpachi's feet to become frictionless. For a split second, the packed earth became as slick as polished, oiled ice. Kenpachi's feet, planted to deliver a powerful blow, slid out from under him. The massive captain, for the first time in the fight, looked utterly bewildered. His attack went wide, the raw power behind it completely wasted as he stumbled to keep his footing. In that moment of imbalance, Naruto struck. He formed a Rasengan. But as he charged, he fed a sliver of his primordial power into it. The swirling blue sphere didn't just contain spinning chakra, it was now surrounded by a faint, colorless corona of distorted space. He slammed it into Kenpachi's exposed side. The impact was bizarre. It wasn't a huge explosion. The Rasengan's chakra ground into Kenpachi's side, tearing at his Shihakusho. While the primordial aura around it seemed to simply delete the spiritual pressure Kenpachi used as armor. The result was a direct, focused hit that sent the huge captain stumbling sideways, a look of shocked delight on his face. Gahahaha. Yes. That's it. He roared, a trickle of blood running from his side. He was completely unfazed by the wound. If anything, it had only excited him more. You didn't just break through my Ryutsu. You ignored it. You little monster. You're full of tricks. He ripped the eye patch from his right eye. The world seemed to lurch. The spiritual pressure that had been a tidal wave was now a supernova. A colossal pillar of raw, golden energy erupted from Kenpachi, screaming into the heavens. The lower-ranking Shinigami in the courtyard collapsed, foaming at the mouth. Even the captains took an involuntary step back. It was the unrestrained power of Zaraki Kenpachi, a force of nature that knew only one thing: battle. Naruto, get back. His power is fully released. You can't block it head-on. Soifon's voice was laced with genuine alarm. But there was nowhere to run. Kenpachi was a blur, moving with a speed that seemed impossible for his size. He was in front of Naruto. His blade a streak of dull metal descending like judgment. Naruto had no time to think. He only had time to react. He threw both hands up, not to block, but to catch. He focused every ounce of his will, every fiber of his being, on the space directly in front of his palms. He didn't try to create a shield. He tried to make that pocket of reality absolute. He willed it to become dense, unmovable, and realer than real. Kenpachi's blade, backed by the full, unrestrained force of his power, slammed into that space. And stopped. The sound was not a clang. It was a deep, guttural, reality-bending bong. A visible shockwave of distorted air erupted from the point of impact, tearing up the ground in a perfect circle around them. Kenpachi's blade was frozen, held less than an inch from Naruto's forehead. Trapped in a plane of solidified space-time. Naruto's arms trembled, the veins on his neck standing out, blood trickling from his nose from the sheer mental strain. He was holding back a god of slaughter with nothing but his will. Every captain watching was frozen in stunned disbelief. Byakuya's noble indifference was shattered, his eyes wide. Mayuri was trembling, muttering about conceptual physics, and rewriting universal constants. Yamamoto's one visible eye was open, and for the first time in a long time, it held a flicker of something other than ancient authority. It held awe. Kenpachi stared, his wild eyes fixed on Naruto. He pushed harder, his muscles bulging, his spiritual pressure tearing the sky apart. But the blade would not move. It was held fast by a law more fundamental than strength. With a final, guttural roar, Kenpachi pulled his blade back. The stalemate was broken. He stood there, panting, his chest heaving, a massive, bloody grin splitting his face. You didn't even use a sword, he gasped out, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and pure joy. You stopped me, with nothing. He looked at Naruto, who was swaying on his feet, his vision blurry, but still standing. He looked at his own sword, then back at the boy. And then he did something no one had ever seen him do before. He drove the tip of his Zanpakuto into the ground, leaning on it, and laughed. It wasn't his battle roar. It was a genuine, deep, rolling laugh of pure, unadulterated respect. You win, kid, he boomed. That was the best fight I've had in years. Any longer and one of us would be dead. And I'm not sure it would have been you. You're all right. He had won. He had faced the monster of the Gote 13 and earned his respect. He had proven he was more than just raw power. As the tension in the courtyard finally broke, miles away, in the quiet, dusty heart of the Seraite's great archives, a lone Shinigami tasked with reshelving ancient scrolls paused. A sudden, unnatural chill filled the aisle, a cold that seemed to leach the very color from the world. He turned, a question on his lips, and saw a figure standing at the far end of the corridor. It wasn't a Shinigami or a hollow. It was a tall, slender being made of what looked like shifting crystal and frozen static. It had no face, only a smooth, featureless plate where one should be. It raised a long, crystalline finger and pointed it at the archivist. The Shinigami opened his mouth to scream, but no sound came out. The world around him dissolved into a gray, hissing static. His body, his soul, his very existence began to unravel, not violently, but with a quiet, sterile efficiency. He was being derezzed, deleted from the equation of the universe. The Arbiter lowered its hand. Where the Shinigami had stood, there was now nothing, not even dust. It turned its attention to the towering shelves. Its directive was clear. All records of the previous Great Silence, all data on primordial energy. All historical accounts of their past interventions. They were a flaw in the equation. A memory that must be erased. It reached out, and the ancient scrolls on the shelf began to fade, there. Ink and paper turning to motes of light and disappearing, leaving behind a perfectly empty space. The Great Silence was coming, and it would begin with a whisper. Chapter 7 End. Chapter 8. The Unholy Trinity. Victory tasted like ash and ozone. Naruto sat on a cot in the 4th Division's infirmary, a sterile white room that smelled faintly of antiseptic herbs. His body was a symphony of aches, the phantom pressure of Kenpachi's final attack still imprinted on his bones. He had won. He had survived the trial. But he felt no triumph. He had simply traded one cage for a slightly larger, more gilded one. He was no longer a target to be eliminated. He was a strategic asset to be monitored, an exotic beast now on display in the Seraite's Grand Zoo. He was not alone. Soifon stood by the window, her arms crossed. Her posture as rigid as the bars he imagined were on the door. She hadn't said a word since they'd brought him here. She just watched the courtyard below, her face an unreadable mask. The earring, their secret line of communication, felt cold against his skin, its purpose served. They were in the same room, yet the distance between them felt vaster than when they were worlds apart. The door slid open with a soft hiss. Captain Retsu Unohana, the gentle, enigmatic commander of the 4th Division, entered, her warm smile a stark contrast to the tension in the room. Behind her, however, was a far more jarring sight. Zaraki Kenpachi, his arm in a sling and a massive bandage wrapped around his torso, ducked under the doorway, a wild, almost proprietary grin on his face. There he is. Kenpachi boomed, his voice making the delicate medicine bottles on the shelves rattle. The little monster who hits like a falling mountain. You look terrible. It was, from Kenpachi, the highest form of compliment. Naruto just stared. You're walking. Ha. It'll take more than one of your weird little space punches to keep me down for long. He strode over, clapping Naruto on the shoulder with his good hand. The force of it nearly drove Naruto through the cot. Unohana here patched me up. Said I was lucky you didn't just delete my ribs. What does that even mean? Doesn't matter. That was a good fight. A real fight. Quote. Captain Zaraki, Unohana said, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable edge of command. The patient requires rest. Right, Kenpachi waved her off. But his manic gaze was still locked on Naruto. Listen, kid, you're alright. Any time you want a rematch, you just let me know. We'll find somewhere bigger to break next time. With a final, bone-jarring clap on the shoulder, he turned and lumbered out of the room, his laughter echoing down the hallway. His presence had been like a hurricane. In his wake, the silence that fell was even heavier. Naruto looked at Unohana. Then at Soifon, something had happened. This wasn't the happy reception a victorious champion should be getting. As if reading his mind, Hana's smile faded slightly. While you were occupied with Captain Zaraki, an incident occurred in the Darishokairo, the Great Spirit Book Archive. Soifon finally turned from the window. What kind of incident? An intrusion, Hana said. Her eyes becoming distant, her gentle demeanor peeling back to reveal the ancient, unfathomable power she kept so well hidden. The alarm was triggered by a Keto Corps patrol. They found the archivist for the deep storage sector, gone. Gone. You mean killed? Naruto asked. No, Hana said, and the word was colder than any winter. I mean gone. Vanished. There was no body, no blood, no sign of a struggle. His Ryutsu signature simply terminates. One moment it is there, the next it is not. But that is not the most disturbing part. None of the patrol members can remember his name. They know a man was on duty. They know his rank and position. But his face, his name, his identity, it has been erased from their memories. Naruto felt a familiar, sickening chill, the same cold he'd felt in the grotto. The static hissed at the edge of his hearing. The scrolls, he said, his voice barely a whisper. What about the scrolls he was working on? Hana's gaze sharpened. They too are gone. An entire section on pre-Gote history, focusing on tales of primordial energies and the chaotic era before the Soul King. The shelf is not broken, not burned. It is simply empty. As if the scrolls were never there to begin with. The space they occupied feels clean. A perfect void. It wasn't a conqueror. It wasn't a killer. It was an editor, redacting reality itself. The arbiter. It had followed him here. Or perhaps, it hadn't needed to. Perhaps it was already here, a silent infection in the system, and his arrival had simply triggered the fever. The gravity of the situation settled over the room. A crushing weight of cosmic dread. The Gote 13 had been fighting wars of swords and souls for 1,000 years. How were they supposed to fight an enemy whose weapon was the concept of non-existence? An emergency summons blared through the barracks, a sharp, piercing tone reserved for matters of the highest urgency. All captains are to assemble at the 1st Division Hall immediately. A disembodied voice announced. Hana looked at Naruto. It seems your trial is not yet over. She then glanced at Soifon. And yours, Captain, is just beginning. The assembly hall was a tomb. The usual storm of competing spiritual pressures was muted, replaced by a single, monolithic feeling of grim uncertainty. Even Kenpachi was silent, his earlier boisterousness gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering anger. This new enemy was something he couldn't just cut. Naruto stood beside Soifon in the center of the room. He was no longer a prisoner or a candidate, he was Exhibit A. In a case that threatened to unravel their entire understanding of the universe. Yamamoto sat, his eyes closed, his face carved from ancient granite. Captain Hana has reported the incident in the archives. Captain Kuritsuchi, your analysis. Mayuri stepped forward, for once without any of his usual theatrical flair. He held a data slate, his painted face a mask of profound, terrified fascination. The energy readings from the site of the erasure are impossible, he said, his voice a strained whisper. They are the inverse of the anomaly's signature. He pointed a long, black-nailed finger at Naruto. He represents a positive 0-point event, creation from nothing. What happened in the archives is a negative 0-point event. Perfect, absolute nullification. Not destruction, which leaves residue. But a complete and total deconstruction of an event's reality. The target was not just erased from the present, it was erased from the past. It is a weapon that attacks causality itself. A cold murmur ran through the assembled captains. A weapon that could rewrite history by deleting it. The implications were staggering. We have been blind, Yamamoto's voice rumbled. While we focused on the threat of Aizen. While we debated the nature of this boy, a far greater cancer has been growing in our very foundations. We are facing an enemy whose nature is beyond our comprehension. As if on cue, a giddy, familiar voice echoed from the entrance of the hall. Oh, I wouldn't say it's beyond comprehension. Just a little outside your usual field of study. Kazuki Urahara sauntered into the room, fanning himself as if he were merely dropping in for tea. He was flanked by a grim-faced Yoruichi Shihoin in her human form, her golden eyes scanning the room with a predator's intensity. Soifon froze, her breath catching in her throat. Yoruichi. After all these years, her mentor, her idol, her greatest betrayer, was standing 10 feet away. A storm of 100 years of anger, hurt, and buried affection crashed through her. But her face remained a perfect, cold mask. She did not even twitch. Urahara. Yamamoto's voice was a crack of thunder. You dare show your face here, exile. Now, head captain. No need to be so formal, Urahara said with a lazy smile, though his eyes were deadly serious. I'm not here as an exile. I'm here as a consultant. Because the cancer you're facing isn't from around here. And lucky for you, I've been studying its faint radiation signatures for decades. He snapped his fan shut. What you're dealing with are not conquerors. They have no ambition. They have no malice. They are, for lack of a better term, janitors. Cosmic janitors. And their job is to clean up anything that disrupts the original state of the universe. And what is that original state? Captain Shunsui Kyoraku asked, his usual lazy demeanor gone. Urahara's smile vanished. Silence. Emptiness. A perfect, orderly state of absolute nothingness. The state that existed before the Soul King, before life. Before consciousness. Before the great essence of existence itself. He turned his gaze to Naruto. Which brings us to our friend here. The power he wields. It's a piece of the entity these janitors serve. A long time ago, this entity, this god of static, was shattered. Its fragments were scattered across the dimensions, inert and harmless. But Naruto's unique spiritual makeup. The collision of a Biju's chaotic life force and the Shinigami's absolute sealing right at his birth, acted like a key. It rebooted his fragment. It woke it up. And now the janitors, the arbiters, are here to clean up the mess, Yoruichi finished, her voice a low, dangerous purr. To erase the fragment, and the world it's attached to, just to be safe. The final, horrifying truth was laid bare. Their enemy wasn't just a threat to the Soul Society. It was a threat to existence itself. They were an error in the cosmic code, and the arbiters were the delete key. How do we fight them? Yamamoto demanded. Urahara let out a long, weary sigh. That's the billion-con question, isn't it? They don't operate on our physical or spiritual plane. They slip through the cracks in reality. To fight them, you need to be able to perceive those cracks. You need a guide. Or, his eyes took on a cunning gleam. You need an enemy who has made it his life's work to find a way to cheat the system. Before anyone could ask what he meant, the air in the center of the hall shimmered. It wasn't a Senkaimon or a Garganta. It was a clean, perfect distortion, like looking through flawless, heated glass. A figure resolved within the distortion, seated on a simple, throne-like chair. He was not physically there. It was a projection, a perfect, three-dimensional image of Sosuke Aizen. The spiritual pressure in the room skyrocketed. Toshiro Hitsugaya was the first to react, his hand flying to his Zanpakuto, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. Aizen. Captain Hitsugaya, Aizen said, his voice calm, smooth, and utterly confident. It was the voice of a man who knew he held all the cards. Still so emotional. You should work on that. His gaze swept across the room, lingering for a moment on Naruto with an almost academic curiosity. Greetings, captains of the Gote 13. And greetings to you, Naruto Uzumaki. I trust my welcoming gift was instructive. You dare show your face here, traitor. Yamamoto roared, his spiritual pressure making the very air feel like a furnace. You will be incinerated. I think not, Aizen said, his smile unwavering. Because as much as you loathe me, and believe me, the feeling is mutual, we have a common problem. You see, I have spent a great deal of time and effort arranging the pieces on this board for my own ascension. I have plans for this universe. And I will not have my masterpiece erased by some mindless, cosmic janitorial staff. He leaned forward, his expression becoming serious. These arbiters, as Urahara so quaintly calls them, are a threat to my ambitions. Which makes them a threat to me. And as the old saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is a temporary, and highly conditional, associate. He was proposing an alliance. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it was stunning. You are insane, Byakuya stated, his voice colder than ice. We would sooner burn with this world than trust you, traitor. Would you? Aizen countered, his voice dripping with condescending logic. Think, Captain Kuchiki. You cannot fight what you cannot find. You do not understand their nature. I do. I have studied the echoes of the god of static for a century, believing it to be the ultimate power, the key to true transcendence. I know how the arbiters move between dimensions. I know where their forward staging ground is located. I can give you a path directly to their heart. He was offering them a targeted strike, a way to fight back. But the price was unthinkable. And what do you ask in return for this generosity? Yamamoto asked, his voice a low growl. Aizen's smile returned. A simple act of good faith. A temporary cessation of hostilities between my forces and yours. And one other small thing. His gaze fell on Naruto. I wish for a sample. A single, pure sample of the anomaly's primordial energy. I wish to study it, to understand how to replicate its unique properties. It is a small price to pay for the salvation of everything you hold dear, is it not? The room exploded. Never. Hitsugaya roared. He wants to weaponize it. Komamura bellowed. He lies. It is a trick. Soifon stood silent through it all, her mind a whirlwind. She looked at Yoruichi, who met her gaze for a split second, a complex, unreadable emotion in her golden eyes. She looked at Naruto, who was staring at the projection of Aizen, his face grim but resolute. And she looked at Aizen, the serpent in the garden, offering them the one thing they needed most: hope. A poisoned, venomous hope, but hope nonetheless. Naruto spoke, his voice cutting through the clamor. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made them all fall silent. What if we say no? He asked Aizen directly. Aizen's smile was almost pitying. Then you will fight your noble, hopeless battle. You will swing your swords at shadows. The arbiters will continue their work, silently, efficiently. They will erase a person here, a memory there. Then a building. Then a district. Then your entire Seraite will simply cease to have ever existed. And you will be none the wiser until the moment you yourselves fade into the static. I, on the other hand, will take my most essential personnel and retreat into the sanctuary of Hueco Mundo and weather the storm. My plans will be delayed, but yours will be annihilated. The choice is yours. It was the ultimate moral dilemma. To accept Aizen's help was to dance with the devil, to potentially give their greatest enemy the very tool he needed to enslave them all. To refuse was to accept annihilation, to be erased from existence by an enemy they couldn't even fight. All eyes turned to Yamamoto. The old man, the pillar of the Gote 13 for 1,000 years, looked ancient, weary, bowed by the weight of an impossible choice. He had led them against Quincy. He had led them against Aizen himself. But this was a war of philosophy, a battle against a concept. He wants to study your power, Soifon said to Naruto, her voice low, for his ears only. If he learns to control it. I know, Naruto whispered back. But I've seen it. I've felt what they do. He's not lying about what will happen if we don't stop them. He had seen the eye in the static. He knew the cold, empty truth of the great silence. He stepped forward, addressing Yamamoto directly. His voice was steady, filled with a certainty that belied his age. Head Captain. You can't trust him. I can't trust him. But he's right about one thing. We fight them together, or we get deleted alone. The arbiters are the fire that's burning down the whole world. Aizen is just the snake that's also in the house. We deal with the fire first. Then we deal with the snake. The raw, simple logic of it, coming from the boy at the center of the storm, was more powerful than any captain's argument. Yamamoto looked at Naruto, then at the projection of Aizen. He took a long, slow breath, the air itself seeming to grow heavy and hot around him. He had built his life, his entire world, on the foundation of order, justice, and the utter condemnation of traitors like Aizen. Now, to save that world, he had to compromise with the very evil he had sworn to destroy. His voice, when he finally spoke, was the sound of a world breaking. We accept your terms. Chapter 8 End. Chapter 9. The Anthem of the Void. The air in Kazuki Urahara's underground training facility was thick enough to drown in. It was a suffocating cocktail of animosity, bloodlust, and ancient, aristocratic pride. The most unlikely strike team in the history of the world stood assembled. A collection of predators forced into the same cage, and every single one of them was ready to tear the others apart. Zaraki Kenpachi leaned against the far wall, his spiritual pressure a wild, untamed sea of joyous violence. His grin fixed in place as he sized up their temporary ally. Byakuya Kuchiki stood ramrod straight, his face a mask of cold contempt, his very presence a silent, searing judgment on the entire sordid affair. And between them, a perfect embodiment of the devil's bargain they had struck, stood Ulquiorra Cipher. The fourth Espada was a statue of nihilistic apathy, his pale skin and melancholic green eyes absorbing the hostility of the room and reflecting nothing. He was Aizen's representative, his leash, his spy, and his presence was a constant, galling reminder of their desperation. Naruto and Soifon stood together, a small island of grim solidarity in the churning sea of animosity. He could feel the tension thrumming through her, the way her muscles were coiled tight at the sight of Ulquiorra. The living symbol of Aizen's betrayal. All right, settle down, children, Urahara's cheerful voice cut through the tension, though his eyes, shadowed by his hat, were deadly serious. He stood before a massive, humming archway that swirled not with the familiar energy of a Senkaimon, but with a fractured, glitching darkness. Aizen's coordinates were, surprisingly, not a lie. This modified Garganta will punch a hole directly into what his probes have identified as the Arbiter's primary command nexus in this reality sector. Think of it as kicking in the front door of a haunted, interdimensional server farm. Quote. He snapped his fan shut. The rules of engagement are simple, because there are no rules. We don't know what we'll find in there. The laws of physics, of spiritual interaction, they might not apply. Aizen's data suggests these things are less like living beings and more like sentient lines of code. Your job is to find the main server, the commander, and delete it. Doing so should disrupt their operations in our world. For a while, at least. And what is to stop this creature? Byakuya's voice was like the crack of winter ice, his gaze fixed on Ulquiorra. From turning on us the moment we are through. Ulquiorra's expression did not change. Lord Aizen wishes for the primary threat to be neutralized. I am merely an instrument of his will. My actions will be dictated by the most logical path to that outcome. You are, for the moment, a useful component of that logic. Nothing more. I'll kill you the second this is over, Kenpachi stated, not as a threat, but as a simple, cheerful promise. Ulquiorra merely blinked. That is also a logical possibility. Enough. Soifon's voice was sharp, cutting through the posturing. All eyes turned to her. She looked at Naruto. A silent communication passing between them, a shared understanding forged in the fire of their last battle. He nodded almost imperceptibly. She then addressed the others, her voice ringing with the authority of the Onmitsukido commander. We are not allies. We are not friends. We are a collection of weapons aimed at the same target. We go in, we destroy the objective, we come out. The moment we are back on this side, all agreements are void. Until then, you will follow my strategic commands, because I am the only one here who has actually fought these things. Are there any objections? Kenpachi just grinned wider. Byakuya gave a stiff, borderline insulting nod of acquiescence. Ulquiorra remained impassive. It was the best she was going to get. Let's go, Naruto said, his voice quiet but firm. He stepped toward the glitching portal, Soifon falling into step beside him. They crossed the threshold, and reality broke. It was not a place. It was a concept. An architect's nightmare rendered in crystal and static. They stood on a floating platform of what looked like polished obsidian in a space of impossible scale. Above and below, crystalline structures grew at mad, non-Euclidean angles. Connected by bridges of frozen light. There was no sun, no sky, only a diffuse, sterile gray illumination that seemed to emanate from the very fabric of the dimension. And there was no sound. No wind, no echo. Nothing. The only noise was the faint, maddening, background hiss of pure static, a sound that seemed to vibrate directly in the bones. So this is the enemy's home, Kenpachi rumbled. His voice sounding unnaturally loud and intrusive in the oppressive silence. It's boring. As if in answer, the arbiters appeared. They didn't walk or teleport. They simply resolved out of the static, glitching into existence on the platforms around them. They were tall, slender beings of shifting crystal, their faceless heads turning towards the intruders. There were dozens of them. The battle began without a war cry, without a single sound. The arbiters attacked, and the team's initial counterattack was a study in futility. Byakuya unleashed his Shikai, 1,000 tiny blades of Senbon Sakura swirling towards the nearest group. The blades passed straight through them as if they were ghosts, dissipating into nothingness. The arbiters were insubstantial. Scatter. Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi, he intoned. Releasing his Bankai. A billion blades formed a vortex around an arbiter. This time, the being flickered, its form distorting under the assault, but it did not break. It simply stepped through the wall of blades, completely unharmed. Kenpachi roared and charged, his Zanpakuto swinging down with enough force to shatter the platform. The blade connected with an arbiter's torso. There was no impact. The arbiters formed erased at the point of contact, the sword passing through, before it reformed instantly behind him. Ulquiorra raised a finger, Acero Escuras, a blast of black, destructive energy. Coalescing with a silent roar. He fired. The beam struck a crystalline wall far in the distance, and was simply absorbed. The wall flickered for a moment and then was still. Useless, the Espada stated. His voice a flat monotone. Our attacks do not register in this reality. Then we make them register. Naruto yelled. He knew what he had to do. He was the anchor. He slammed his palms together and focused, his primordial aura flaring out, not as an attack, but as an imposition of will. He didn't target the arbiters. He targeted the space they all occupied. Be real, he commanded, his voice echoing not in the air, but in their minds. A dome of faint, colorless energy expanded from him, washing over the platform. For a moment, nothing changed. Then, everything did. The crystalline beings flickered violently. The air suddenly had weight. The silence was broken by the faintest hum of energy. Now, Naruto roared, the strain already showing on his face. Kenpachi, sensing the change instantly, swung again. This time, his blade connected with a hideous, grating screech of tearing data. The arbiter it struck cracked like glass, a fissure of black noth. Ingness spreading across its form before it shattered into a cloud of dissipating static. It had worked. Naruto's power was a patch on their broken reality, forcing the arbiters in his zone to adhere to the crude laws of cause and effect. The tide of the battle turned. The team, now understanding the new rules, fought with a brutal, grudging efficiency. Naruto became the eye of the storm, the linchpin holding their reality together. While the others became instruments of pure destruction within his influence. Byakuya, left flank. They're phasing at the edge of the zone, keep them contained. Soifon's voice, sharp and clear, cut through the mental chaos. Byakuya, without a word, shifted his Bankai, forming a cage of blades at the very edge of Naruto's reality bubble. Kenpachi, stop chasing the big one and clear the platform. Overwhelm them. The captain of the 11th squad let out a joyous roar and began to carve a path of destruction through the lesser arbiters, his blade now shattering them with every blow. Ulquiorra, ranged support, hit the ones reforming outside the perimeter. The Espada, his face betraying nothing, began launching precise, powerful Ceros, obliterating arbiters as they tried to regroup beyond Naruto's influence. And in the center of it all, Naruto and Soifon fought as if they were two parts of a single being. Their synergy was breathtaking, a dance of chaos and precision. She was a black-clad blur of motion, her perfect shunpo drawing the arbiters in, her blade a flickering test to find their weak points. He was her anchor and her shield, moving his bubble of reality with her. Expanding it to protect her from a flanking enemy, shrinking it to concentrate its effect on a tougher target. His power gave her a battlefield where her skills could matter. And her speed and tactical brilliance allowed him to focus his power where it was needed most. They fought their way across a bridge of light towards a larger, central spire, leaving a trail of shattered code in their wake. But as they neared the entrance, a new type of arbiter appeared. It was larger, thicker, its crystalline form a deeper, more absolute black. A sentinel. It ignored Kenpachi's charge. It ignored Byakuya's wall of blades. It had only one target. It raised a hand, and from its palm issued not a blast of energy, but a wave of pure, conceptual erasure. A tide of gray, static that didn't destroy what it touched, but simply unwrote it from existence. The bridge of light it washed over vanished, leaving only empty space. It was coming for Naruto. The attack was too fast. Naruto was holding the reality anchor for the entire team, he couldn't drop it and form a defense in time. He saw the wave of nothingness coming, and for a split second, he knew he was dead. Then, a black blur slammed into him, shoving him out of the path of the wave. It was Soifon. She had used her own body to push him to safety, but in doing so, had left herself no time to escape. She turned, her eyes wide, as the tide of static washed towards her. Time stretched into an infinite, silent scream. Naruto saw the erasure wave, inches from her. He saw the look of defiant acceptance on her face. And a rage unlike anything he had ever felt. Not the hot, burning rage of the Kyuubi, but a cold, absolute rage that rejected this outcome, erupted from the core of his being. He dropped the reality anchors. Kenpachi roared in frustration as his sword passed through an arbiter. Byakuya's blades fizzled. But Naruto didn't care. He focused everything he was, every ounce of his will and his power, on the single point in space that was Soifon. He didn't create a shield. He did something more fundamental. He wrapped her in a cocoon of his own reality, a bubble of absolute, undeniable existence. The gray static wave crashed against it. And broke. It was like watching water splash against a stone. The concept of non-existence had met the concept of her, reinforced by his power, and it had been found wanting. The feedback was a physical blow. It felt like his brain was being torn in half. He collapsed to one knee, blood pouring from his nose and ears, the world spinning violently around him. The sentinel, its attack having failed, paused, as if trying to process the error. That pause was all Kenpachi needed. With a bellowing war cry, he leapt across the chasm created by the erased bridge. His Ryutsu flaring now that he was no longer bound by Naruto's anchor, and brought his blade down on the sentinel's head. With a deafening shriek of corrupted data, the creature shattered. Soifon stood, trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was alive. She had been touched by utter oblivion and was still here. She looked over at Naruto, who was struggling to get to his feet, swaying, his face pale. He had just saved her from being erased from time and space. The rest of the battle faded into a dull roar. She moved to him, her shunpo bringing her to his side in an instant. She caught his arm, steadying him. He looked at her, his vision swimming, but his eyes were blazing with a fierce, protective light. "I'm not letting you disappear," he gasped out. In the midst of a battle for the fate of reality, surrounded by monsters and killers, Soifon reached out, her hand, no longer a weapon but something impossibly gentle, and touched his face. Her thumb brushed away the blood from his cheek. "Survive this, Naruto," she whispered, her voice tight with an emotion she hadn't allowed herself to feel in over a century. "See the dawn with me." It wasn't a question. It was a command. A plea. A promise. He managed a weak, bloody grin. Deal. The pact was sealed. They were no longer just fighting alongside each other. They were fighting for each other. They pushed forward into the spire. The central chamber was a vast, silent cathedral of computation. And in the center, floating above a dais of pure light, was the Arbiter Commander. It was not a humanoid figure, but a colossal, rotating gyre of crystalline fractals and pure information, its presence so immense it made the very air feel thick as water. Less than flawed variable, greater than a voice echoed in all their minds, a communication of pure, cold concept. Less than contagion detected. The equation must be purified. The great silence will restore order. Greater than. "Let's shut this thing up for good," Kenpachi growled, launching himself forward. The final battle was a symphony of desperation. Kenpachi and Ulquiorra became a battering ram of raw power, unleashing their full might in relentless, hammering blows that the commander simply absorbed, its fractal form rippling. Byakuya used his Bankai, Gokei, to form a spherical prison of a billion blades, attempting to trap and shred the commander from all sides. The prison held for a moment, before the commander simply deleted a section of it and pulsed, sending the blades scattering. It was too powerful. They were chipping away at a mountain with pickaxes. "It's not working," Soifon yelled, her voice echoing in Naruto's mind via the earring. "Its regenerative and defensive capabilities are absolute." Naruto, leaning heavily on her for support, watched the commander. He saw how it was absorbing their attacks, converting their energy into its own. They couldn't destroy it with power. They had to unwrite it, just as it had tried to unwrite her. "I have an idea," he gasped, his head throbbing. "I can make the weapon. But I can't deliver it. You have to." Soifon's eyes widened as she understood. You can't. The strain will kill you. Not if you're the one channeling it, he countered. Your power is focused. Disciplined. Mine is chaos. Combine them. It was insane. But it was their only shot. She nodded once, her expression set like stone. She took a deep breath, raising her right arm. Bankai. An explosion of reishi erupted from her. The delicate stinger of Suzumaki was gone, replaced by the massive, golden armor and missile launcher of Jakuho Reikoben. It was a weapon of overwhelming, unsettled destruction, a stark contrast to her entire philosophy. The missile is just a shell, she said to Naruto. A focusing lens. Give me the warhead. He placed his hands on the golden launcher. The others, sensing the shift, fell back, forming a defensive perimeter. Naruto closed his eyes, reaching deep into the static-filled void inside him. He didn't draw on its power. He seized it. He grabbed the very concept of nullification, of non-existence, and began to forge it into a shape. A swirling vortex of nothingness, a perfect sphere of anti-reality, coalesced in the warhead of the Bankai. It was a Rasengan made of the void. A primordial spear. The strain was unimaginable. The world dissolved into white noise and agony. He poured everything he was into that single point. Soifon gritted her teeth, her own Ryutsu straining to contain the impossible energy he was feeding into her Bankai. The golden launcher began to crack, unable to handle the conceptual stress. It was now or never. She aimed. Jakuho Reikoben. She screamed, firing not a missile, but a silent, perfect sphere of absolute nothing. It did not fly. It simply arrived. The space between He Bankai and the Arbiter Commander was deleted. One moment the sphere was there, the next it was at the heart of the fractal gyre. There was no explosion, no sound, no light. The Arbiter Commander just stopped. The complex, rotating fractals froze. A single, black pinprick appeared in its center. And then, the blackness spread, like ink in water. The light, the crystal, the very being of the commander was consumed by the perfect, silent void that Naruto and Soifon had created together. It cracked like a sheet of glass, and then dissolved into a final, fading hiss of static. But before the last mote of its consciousness faded, a final, triumphant message echoed through their minds, a signal sent to its slumbering master. Less than the master is awake. The great silence is coming. Greater than. The dimension began to collapse. The crystalline structures shattered, the platforms crumbled, the entire universe they were enfolding in on itself. Urahara. Now. Yoruichi's voice, which had been guiding them from the outside, screamed in their heads. A garganta ripped open behind them. They scrambled through, Naruto practically carried by Soifon and Kenpachi, diving through the portal just as the Arbiter's dimension imploded. Winking out of existence as if it had never been. They tumbled onto the stone floor of the training facility, battered, bleeding, and utterly exhausted. They were alive. They had won. But as the portal snapped shut, casting them into the sudden, mundane silence of the basement, the Arbiter's final message echoed in their minds. They hadn't won a war. They had just survived the opening skirmish. And they had rung the dinner bell for God. Chapter 9 End. Chapter 10. The First Dawn. They fell out of the Garganta and into a world that was already coming apart at the seams. The Saint. One floor of Urahara's training facility was rippling like water. A rack of strange, scientific instruments against the far wall flickered in and out of existence, their forms dissolving into a gray, hissing static before snapping back into reality. The very air had a texture, a low, grinding hum that resonated deep in their bones, the sound of the universe's engine stripping its gears. Naruto collapsed, Soifon and Kenpachi barely managing to keep him from hitting the floor. The strain of forging and delivering the void sphere had left him utterly spent, his own primordial aura guttering like a dying candle. He was conscious, but only just, his vision a swimming blur. Report. Yoruichi snapped, her golden eyes wide with an alarm that dwarfed anything she'd shown during Aizen's betrayal. The commander is destroyed, Soifon said, her voice strained as she supported Naruto's weight. But it sent a final message. It said the master was awake. Urahara, his goofy grin completely gone, placed by the grim visage of a scientist watching the end of the world, pointed a trembling finger at the massive stone slab that served as a ceiling. It wasn't just a message. It was a key, a signal to open the door. As he spoke, A crack appeared in the stone above them. It was not a physical fracture. It was a fissure of pure, black static, a tear in the veil of the world. Through it, they could see not the sky of the land of Ti, but the impossible, deep blue night of the Seraite. The fissure widened, branching out like lightning, and through other cracks, glimpses of the white towers of Los Noches and the deep forests of the land of fire appeared. The walls between worlds were not just thinning, they were shattering. It's here, Naruto whispered, his voice a dry rasp. He could feel it. The vast, empty, mindless presence. The god of static was no longer a vision in his mind. It was a pressure in the air, a cold that had nothing to do with temperature, a silence that was beginning to swallow all other sounds. The glitches intensified. Kenpachi let out a roar of frustration as the bandages on his torso flickered, becoming for a split second the pristine uniform he'd worn before the fight. The wound he'd sustained from Naruto never having existed. Byakuya's pristine Haori shifted, its white fabric turning the deep crimson of his clan's enemies for a horrifying moment. Causality was fraying. The past and present were bleeding into one another. We cannot fight this, Ulquiorra stated, his voice the first to break the horrified silence. It was not a statement of fear, but of fact. This is not an enemy. It is a state change. The universe is being reverted to its factory settings. Then we'll just have to break the factory. Kenpachi bellowed, but his bravado was hollow. Even he, a man who lived to fight the impossible, seemed to understand that his sword was useless against the end of everything. Urahara made a decision. He slammed his palm on a complex seal array on the floor. I'm opening a direct channel to the First Division. If we're going to be erased, we'll be erased together. A massive Senkaimon roared to life, not a swirling vortex, but a stable, open doorway. Through it, they could see the grim, assembled faces of the remaining Gote 13 captains, with Yamamoto at their head. Simultaneously, Yoruichi bit her thumb and slammed her own hand down. A reverse summoning array flaring to life. A swirl of smoke, and Kakashi Hatake, Might Guy, and a pale but resolute Tsunade appeared, their expressions a mixture of confusion and immediate, professional alarm. What in the world is happening, Urahara? Tsunade demanded, her eyes taking in the impossible sight of Shinigami and Arankar standing in the same room. The world is ending, Princess Tsunade, Urahara said simply. Welcome to the apocalypse. The true manifestation began. The static pouring from the cracks in reality coalesced. It did not form a monster or a titan. It formed a wave, a slow, inexorable tide of gray nothingness that began to wash over the world. Where it passed, things did not break, they simply stopped being. The ground it touched became a smooth, featureless gray plain. The air it filled became utterly silent and still. It was the entropy of the universe, given a terrible, final purpose. All forces, engage. Yamamoto's voice was the roar of a dying lion. Kido Core. Erect the strongest barrier you can. All captains, release your Bankai. We will hold the line or we will die in the attempt. The battle was a masterpiece of futility. A storm of unimaginable E-power was unleashed against the silent, creeping tide. Shunsui's Kaden Kyokutsu created games of life and death that the static simply ignored. Hitsugaya's Daegyur and Hirinmaru sent waves of apocalypse. Tick ice that were absorbed without a trace. Even the searing, sun-like flames of Yamamoto's Ryujin Jaka, a power that could incinerate the very soul, seemed to merely warm the encroaching cold before being extinguished. The shinobi fared no better. Guy opened the seventh gate, his body wreathed in a fearsome blue aura, and unleashed a Hirudora that punched a hole in the tide, only for the static to sluggishly flow back in and seal the gap, as if it were merely water. It was like trying to punch the ocean. They were emptying their very souls, their life's work of power and training, into an enemy that simply did not care. And then, in the heart of the chaos, he arrived. Sosuke Aizen stepped through a personal Garganta, Jin Ichimaru and Konami Tosen flanking him. He was no longer a projection. He was here, in the flesh. And the Hogyoku embedded in his chest pulsed with a hungry, amethyst light. He ignored the battle raging around him, his calm, analytical gaze fixed on one person, Naruto. Such a beautiful, tragic display. Aizen mused, his voice cutting through the din of battle. The mightiest souls in existence, throwing their pathetic tantrums against the inevitable. You see, this is why you will always fail. You seek to destroy, to overwhelm. You do not understand. Power is not meant to be a sledgehammer. It is a key. He took a step forward, the static tide parting before him as if respecting a fellow predator. This entity is mindless. A force of nature. It is a body without a brain, a god without a will. And nature, as they say, abhors a vacuum. His smile was terrifying, filled with the light of divine madness. The Hogyoku desires to fill that vacuum. By merging with the fragment inside you, Naruto Uzumaki, by using you as the bridge, I can become the consciousness of this entity. I will not be a god in the soul society. I will be the god of reality. I will be the will that directs the storm, the mind that gives this silence a voice. And the first thing I shall do is erase the very concept of defiance. This was his endgame. Not to steal the power, but to become it. You're insane. Kakashi snarled, his Sharingan blazing to life. Am I? Aizen countered. Or am I the only one who sees the true opportunity here? He raised a hand, and the air around Naruto began to compress. He wasn't attacking the god of static. He was going for the key. But he had miscalculated. He had assumed his enemies were still focused on the tide. He had not accounted for the fragile, battle-forged bonds that had just been created. Get away from him. The roar was not from a shinobi or a shinigami. It was from Kenpachi, the captain of the 11th squad, who had moments before been flinging himself uselessly at the static, now had a new target. A target he could cut. With a blood-curdling laugh, he charged Aizen, his blade held high. Simultaneously, Byakuya moved, his Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi forming not to attack, but to create a protective wall of a billion blades between Aizen and Naruto. Your ambitions end here, traitor, he said, his voice colder than the void itself. The battle shifted. The main forces of the Gote 13 and the shinobi continued their hopeless fight against the static tide. Buying time. But the elite, Kenpachi, Byakuya, Yoruichi, Urahara, and now a furiously protective Soifon, converged on Aizen. The traitor was powerful, his Kyoka sway. Getsu a nightmare of illusion and deception, but he was facing a storm of captain-class opponents, each one with a deep, personal grudge, all moving with the desperate clarity of a world on the brink. Aizen was forced back. Kenpachi's sheer, unpredictable ferocity was the perfect counter to his illusions. The captain of the 11th didn't care which one was real, he just cut everything. Yoruichi's speed and mastery of Hakuta made her impossible to pin down, a golden blur of fists and feet. And Soifon, she fought with a cold, silent fury that was terrifying to behold. Every move was designed to protect Naruto, to intercept any attack that came near him. She was no longer just a captain, she was a shield. This is pointless, Aizen finally snarled, parrying a blow from Kenpachi that cracked the very ground beneath them. You are only delaying the inevitable. You cannot win. He shimmered, a perfect illusion of him appearing behind Naruto while the real one retreated. But Soifon didn't even turn. She lashed out with a back fist without looking, shattering the illusion. She had memorized his Ryutsu, his very soul's signature. She would not be fooled again. With a final curse, Aizen, Jin, and Tosen vanished into a garganta. Enjoy your oblivion. His voice echoed. I will return to claim the ashes of your world. He was gone. But the tide of static remained, closer now, the end of all things just moments away. In the eye of the storm, Naruto finally understood. Aizen was wrong. But he was also right. The entity was mindless. A cage without a warden. A body without a soul. It wasn't an enemy to be beaten. It was a force to be contained. And he was the only container in existence that was the right shape. He pushed himself away from Soifon's support, standing on his own 2 feet, his legs trembling but holding. He looked at the chaos, at his friends, at the Shinigami who had once been his enemies, all fighting a battle they were doomed to lose. He looked at Soifon, her face pale with exhaustion and fear. Her eyes screaming at him not to do what she already knew he was going to do. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, the same way she had in the Arbiter's dimension. You told me to see the dawn with you, he said, his voice surprisingly steady. Naruto. No, she whispered, her voice breaking. Don't. We'll find another way. We both know there isn't one, he said, his smile faint and sad. This was always my fight. I was born with a monster inside me. Maybe this is what it was all for. To learn how to be a good cage. He looked at the encroaching tide of nothingness. It isn't evil. It's just empty. It needs a heart, a will, something to stop it from just ending things. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against hers, a final, silent goodbye. I'll be here, he whispered. I'll hold it back. I'll make sure there's a dawn for you to see. Always. Before she could stop him, he turned and walked towards the tide. He didn't charge it. He didn't prepare an attack. He just walked, with a calm, resolute purpose that silenced the entire battlefield. Everyone stopped fighting, their eyes fixed on the lone, orange-clad figure walking to meet the end of the world. He stopped at the edge of the static, the gray nothingness lapping at his feet. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and opened himself. He did not fight the void. He invited it in. The effect was instantaneous and absolute. The tide of static stopped its advance. It reversed its flow. The entire, world-ending wave of nullification, the very essence of the god of static, began to pour into Naruto. It was not a violent explosion. It was a terrifying, silent implosion. The gray static flowed into him, a river of non-existence being drawn into a single, human soul. His body began to glow. Not with the warm yellow of his own chakra, but with a cold, white light, shot through with veins of the blackest static. He was thrown into the air, his body arching in agony as a power that predated stars flooded his being. He screamed, a raw, human sound of a soul being unmade and remade into something new. The 8 trigrams seal on his stomach flared to life, not as a barrier, but as a focusing lens. A spiritual framework that was now housing not just a fox, but a god. The last of the static tide was drawn into him. The cracks in reality sealed themselves. The world, scarred and battered, snapped back into its proper shape. The oppressive silence was gone, replaced by the mundane sounds of the wind and the stunned, ragged breathing of the survivors. Naruto floated back down to the ground, his feet touching the earth without a sound. He was different. His torn orange jacket was gone, replaced by a simple, flowing black coat that seemed woven from the fabric of night. His hair was still blonde, but it seemed to hold less light. And his eyes, his bright, cerulean blue eyes were gone. They were now twin pools of the deepest midnight, vast and endless, swirling with the faint silver motes of distant galaxies and the hissing gray of the static he now contained. They were the eyes of the abyss, but for the first time, the abyss had a conscience. He was Naruto Uzumaki. But he was also something more. The guardian. The warden. The silent, eternal shore against which the tide of nothingness would break. He had not destroyed the god. He had become its master. Its keeper. Its heart. The assembled shinobi and shinigami stared in awestruck, terrified silence. They were looking at a boy who had just swallowed the end of the world. Soifon was the first to move. She walked towards him, her steps unwavering, pushing past captains and comrades who looked at her as if she were insane. She walked right up to him, close enough to touch. She looked into those terrifying, cosmic eyes, searching for the boy she had fought with, the boy she had made a promise to. He looked down at her, and for a split second, a flicker of the old, warm blue shone through the abyss. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. The sun began to rise, its first rays cresting the horizon, painting the edge of the broken world in hues of orange and gold. It was the most beautiful dawn any of them had ever seen. Naruto looked at the rising sun, the light reflecting in his star-filled eyes. The first dawn, he said, his voice quiet, yet resonating with the weight of eternity. Soifon stood beside him, her small, determined form a stark contrast to the cosmic being he had become. She reached out and took his hand. It was cold, like the space between stars, but she held it tight, her warmth a defiant anchor. And not the last, she replied, her voice an unbreakable promise. They stood together, a shinigami captain and a boy who had become a god, facing the sunrise of a new world they had saved. Their future uncertain, their responsibilities immense, but their path, for the first time, perfectly clear. They would face it together. Chapter 10 End.